And welcome to the Southern Pine Beetle Impacts in Massachusetts workshop / meeting that we're having today. We have a great number of people attending. We have 50 that are on now, and we expect hopefully double that. But we will be starting with a quick little intro. I myself and Eric Alexander work for the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange program that is hosted by the Forest Stewards Guild, who I work for, and the Northeast Forest Fire Protection Compact, who Eric Evanson works for. Eric is the man behind the curtain running the operations today. So Eric is our science communications specialist, and I'm the Northeast Fire Projects Manager. And so with the program today, we will be focusing, of course, on Massachusetts. Southern Pine Beetle outbreak has unfortunately occurred in Massachusetts, and we've brought together through the Southern Pine Beetle Working Group that was established. How many years ago was it established, Kevin? Like 5 years ago?
We are coming up on 5 years. Yeah,
5 years
2022,
ago.
we had our first meeting. Yep.
Yeah. So as an outgrowth of the collaboration and work that had been done on Long Island and was brought to wider reach through creating the Southern Pine Beetle Working Group through the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. So we have two working groups, a fire history working group in Southern Pine Beetle, and the Southern Pine Beetle Working Group has put this together under Kevin Dodd's leadership, who's the entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service out of Durham. So our program today, a few little housekeeping items, is that we will have a break at 10:30 to 10:45, a 15-minute break. But of course, this is online, so if you need a break, please, by all means, step away. We will be accepting questions within the chat, and also we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the program today around 12. So we will be moving along in that regard. 1 second. So just a quick infomercials on some upcoming programs is the Northeast Midwest Prescribed Fire Science and Management Workshop is being hosted on July 21st through the 23rd. It's an online workshop. And with the exception on the 22nd, there will be both local field trips. I know there's some happening in Massachusetts. And then for those that are interested in participating in the field trip, there is a online workshops that are available. The Joint Fire Science Exchange Program is what supports NAFSE and the other 15 exchanges across the country. And if you're interested in getting updates and news on webinars, meetings, and research, you can go and subscribe to the Flash Friday e-news. You can also go to the Forest Stewards Guild. Here are some references and materials that are available on our website that would help related to forest and fire management to help improve your forest and resiliency to Southern Pine Beetle. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Dodds, who will be kicking off the program today.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Polly, for that, and thanks, Eric, for running everything in the background, getting us advertised and getting the word out to everyone. So it's always great to partner with NAFSE and the Guild to do these information sessions. And so I also want to thank the speakers for taking some time to get ready, put together presentations for this and get some information out, and all of the attendees as well, because I know, this is a difficult time of year for all of us. I think we're balancing, field work and office work and trying to keep on top of everything. And then also, I do want to give a shout out to Jake McCumber. You're going to hear from him later, but Jake got sort of this information email list group going around over the winter for the Cape and extends, into Massachusetts and probably broader than that too. But and it's probably how some of you found out about this meeting too. So if you're unfamiliar with that, Jake, or I think Jake's going to put his email address into the chat. And if you're not on that list already, send Jake a message and he can add you to that list. And right now, that's our primary information outlet, really. So if you have any questions after this, even that, that we don't get to, or if something comes up later, you can send an email to that group, and participants on there will either answer those questions or find somebody who can provide that. So it's been it's a great group to have, and I think we can probably grow its use after this too, and especially going into what could be a pretty hectic summer and fall. Um, Polly mentioned we're coming up on 5 years. Really, the objective of forming this group was, I was working on, obviously the insect part of this as a forest entomologist. We were pretty comfortable with networking amongst all of the forest health practitioners and all of our colleagues in state and other federal agencies and our partners, especially in the Southeast, that were really helpful. Um, but the more we started working on that, the more we were seeing, okay, there's this large community of pitch pine folks, prescribed fire, fire management, or I'm sorry, forest management, silviculture folks working in pitch pine and restoration. And there's this long legacy of that. And so we really wanted to, merge those two communities really and share information amongst us. And so that was the hope, from that first one. And I think right away we all saw the benefits of this. And so my hope is that, today we bring in even more people and grow that community, right? And so share your expertise, ask questions of the speakers or afterwards, and we can really, have as much information pass between us to deal with southern pine beetle on a large landscape over, a lot of different land use and land ownership, and it's really going to take all of us to get a handle on this. So I think really that's all I have to say. And I just look forward to the discussions today. Polly, am I kicking back to you for Caroline or?
Um, I would go ahead and introduce Caroline. You're already up.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm excited to hear Caroline Kanaski speak today. She always does such a great job. Caroline worked on Southern Pine Beetle for since 2017. We were just talking about this, and that seems crazy to me, as it does to her too. But uh, Caroline did all of her graduate work at UNH on Southern Pine Beetle, and now is an assistant professor at University of Maine in Fort Kent. And we're psyched to have her here today. So I'll kick it over to you, Caroline. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Is my screen looking okay?
Looks good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's when he starts sharing, it looks a little weird. But thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. And yeah, so my goal, my task today is to really introduce the biology and the natural history of the southern pine beetle. So kind of how does it live its life? Why is it causing the problems that it does? And hopefully give you a greater understanding of how that works. And please drop some questions in the chat. I don't know if I'll be able to read them right away, but I want to make sure that I'm giving us a good background for all the rest of the information that will be shared today by the other awesome speakers. So, kind of an overview. I want to go over the range of southern pine beetle, where it's from, what are its host trees, what are the signs and symptoms, how do you know you have southern pine beetle in a tree, and this is where I'm going to sprinkle in more about the life cycle, actually, how does it go from egg to larva to adult. I'll go into a little bit about the southern pine beetle associates, like other animals that you might see associated with southern pine beetle infestations. And then I'll end with some outbreak dynamics, kind of how are they able to really kill these large amounts of trees? It's kind of unusual for a forest insect. So, oh, lost my arrow there. Okay. So starting us off, here is our southern pine beetle. It is very tiny, as you can see that 1 millimeter scale bar. It's about the size of half a grain of rice, so keep that in mind. You'll also hear us call it SPB for short. I'll probably mix and match southern pine beetle and SPB throughout my talk. I like to start off with the fact that its scientific name is Dendroctonus frontalis. And Dendroctonus means tree killer in Greek, which is very appropriate for an insect that's able to kill healthy pine trees. Um, and they're able to mass attack these pine trees. So I'll get into that in a minute. They're not just one beetle killing a tree, but lots, thousands of beetles probably. I don't have an exact count on that. But kind of the reason why we're all here and the reason why there's been so much talk about southern pine beetle and research about southern pine beetle over the past 125 years in the United States is that they're very impactful to the economy and also the forest ecology. So, particularly in the southeastern US, folks are trying to harvest shortleaf and loblolly pine. That's not so much what's going on with southern pine beetle in New England, but rather we're talking about a big ecological change. And lastly, I really want to stress, especially for like the forest insect person in me, like this is a native insect to North America. You probably have heard about a lot of other forest pests like emerald ash borer that are imported via shipping from other countries, but this is really something that is native to North America, not exactly, hasn't always been in Massachusetts, for example, but we're not talking about something that got here kind of by accident or from shipping. So to kind of start us off, where are they from? Where are these beetles found? They're obviously found in Massachusetts, or else we wouldn't be talking about this today in this context. But here's a map of kind of the range of southern pine beetle. And so historically, and I don't know if folks can see my cursor. I would like if you could.
I can see your
Uh,
cursor.
you can? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So kind of the core of the southern pine beetle range and where a lot of research has been done on the beetle's biology and life cycle is kind of this like southeastern chunk of the United States from like Texas east to Florida. And historically, the northern range of southern pine beetle has kind of been like southern Pennsylvania, right on the border, and into New Jersey. As you can see over here, there is some kind of more isolated populations in Arizona, New Mexico, Central America, Mexico. I won't be talking about any specifics from that area today. But so where we're kind of talking about moving northward, southern pine beetle is obviously in our region. It's been on Long Island, New York since about 2014. That's when it was first identified, killing trees there. And that kind of sparked some more research in the New England area. So in 2014, southern pine beetle was found in some dying pitch pines on Long Island, New York. And then that sparked a lot of monitoring for southern pine beetle. So you'll hear about those exact monitoring efforts, I believe, from the New York and Massachusetts crowd in a little bit today. But that kind of work was extremely helpful in building our understanding, like as a forest insect people community, where is southern pine beetle? What are the populations doing? How are they growing over time? And I think I'm pretty sure I'm correct on this. In 2023, southern pine beetle infested trees were found on Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket Islands. And now there's kind of some scattered attacks on the Cape, from what I understand. So we've seen some kind of continued northward movement of southern pine beetle in these areas. And then what are they doing in these areas? What kind of host trees are they using? So generally, we can say that southern pine beetle uses pine family trees. And I pulled this little list from iNaturalist. Here's our pines or pine family trees we would see in Massachusetts. Of course, things like white pine, pitch pine, also spruces, balsam fir, larch, and hemlock. Those are kind of our major pine family trees. But specifically, the pines, obviously, as southern pine beetle has been named for, are the primary host. In the southeastern US, the hard or the yellow pines are the most common host, and that's loblolly and shortleaf pine for the most part. And in our region, we're talking about pitch pine as the primary host. And so that's the topic of my next couple of slides. And I probably don't have to tell you too much about pitch pine and how cool it is. But this is a tree that has three needles, and I was always taught like pitch, like baseball, like three strikes and you're out, kind of trying to make that connection. And it usually has this kind of chunky, flaky bark or like blocky bark, I guess I would say. It can be a little bit variable, but it's a pretty cool tree, and it grows in some pretty awesome places. Oh, I had some animations here. So yeah, three needles per bundle or for fascicle is one of your identification cues. And losing my cursor, it has, I guess I would say, some scaly bark. It's pretty rough looking. And pitch pine is primarily found in these kind of pitch pine barrens, these kind of sandy soil places with this like scrubby undergrowth. You might have some um, bare oak, scrub oak, blueberries, ferns kind of in the understory. And if you've been in these forests, you know, they're pretty cool. It's very different from kind of the feel you might get in other forest types. I've heard some folks talk about how it's so easy to get lost in the pitch pine barrens because you get kind of turned around. It looks very similar everywhere you look. Um, and pitch pines or pine barrens are a pretty rare forest ecosystem. And that's part of, I think, why we're all coming together around this topic today. And I like to show these two maps of two types of pine barrens, the interior pine barrens and the coastal plain pitch pine barrens, just to give you a feel for how kind of rare they are on the landscape. I'm sorry to Massachusetts folks that the Cape and adjacent areas are kind of cut off over here on my right side of the screen. But that is where a lot of pitch pine is in our region. And so it's really, really special and something worth managing and worth caring for. And additionally, the pitch pine barrens, you know, obviously they are home to pitch pines, but they're also home to some globally and locally rare species, both, you know, birds, plants, wildflowers, some pretty cool wildlife. So also another reason to keep these forests around and healthy. So, something I wanted to definitely mention early on in my talk is that these pine barrens require disturbances like fire to stay healthy. And so that'll be kind of a recurring theme, I think, over the different talks today. Kevin will be up next talking about management. And so I just wanted to really stress that for optimum health, we do want to we need to incorporate disturbance or allow disturbance to occur in these forests in order to have these trees be as resilient as possible to a threat like southern pine beetle. And just a quick note about like some of the adaptations that pitch pine has for fire. It has quite a few, but one of the most, I think, like visible ones is the fact that when the cones are first formed, they're very tightly closed. And then through the heating process during fire, they're able to open and the seeds are able to, you know, go on and make new pitch pines. So that's just one of the very visible ways that we know pitch pine is adapted to tolerating fire. My last thing about hosts is that these pine barrens have largely been neglected in our region. Not all of them, because I know there's some people on this call doing some amazing work. But some reasons for this general kind of lack of management is that pitch pine is not really valued economically in our region. There's not a lot of uses for it. But you could absolutely use it, but it's not something that has been traditionally very valuable. Fire has been suppressed, and probably, you know, for some good reasons, because we do have a lot of forest and the human community interface. And so understandably, we want to keep people safe, keep people and property safe. But generally, these pine barrens are largely unmanaged, and we want to really stress that taking some action to improve the health and resilience of pitch pine is necessary in order to deal with this threat of southern pine beetle. And so I kind of want to say, from what I've seen a lot of, and in general, even without the threat of southern pine beetle, many of our pitch pine forests today are not that healthy. And so we do need this management component. Oh, Felicia, give me a thumbs up. And just to give you a brief kind of overview of what this could look like, this is not a photo of Massachusetts, but of one of my study sites for my PhD in Maine. But what I want to stress to you here is that there is a good bit of management happening, and I think it's pretty clear to see the delineation of where they've been working on this property and where management has yet to happen. And so just to kind of draw that out, we kind of have this managed forest that's a bit more open, a lot more sun reaching the forest floor versus this very densely stocked, unmanaged forest. So I really like this image to really give us a stark contrast of kind of what it looks like to manage this kind of forest type. Okay, so getting into some signs and symptoms. So now we have the backdrop. We know we're in the pine barrens in our minds, at least. But so what should we be looking for on the ground? How do we know if southern pine beetle is present in the forest? And just to stress one more time, southern pine beetles are very tiny. That's my hand. So like you're looking for something very, very tiny, but luckily the signs and symptoms of southern pine beetle are a bit more visible and larger than this very tiny half a grain of rice insect. And so I mentioned briefly before that southern pine beetles mass attack healthy trees. And so that means like thousands of beetles are attacking one tree at one time. And the very visible part of this is that the trees are fighting back against the beetle with resin defenses. So what you're seeing there, these kind of little blobs, are the resin or the pitch of the tree being pushed out at the places where southern pine beetle has attacked the tree. And so the major sign of southern pine beetle, we would say, is the pitch tubes, which some people call popcorn because when the pitch is really dried, it does look kind of like popcorn. As you can see, there's two pieces of actual popcorn in the photo there next to some of the pitch tubes. And then kind of what's going on like before the pitch gets dried up is that the beetles, oh, I thought I had a video. And there it is. The beetles are actually swimming through the pitch, which is pretty incredible. Like if you ever cut down a pine tree or, cut some limbs off one or cut down your own Christmas tree, for example, like that pitch is really sticky, very tacky. It sucks to get on your hands or your clothes or whatever. But the beetles are swimming through it. So that's for all the trouble this beetle gives us, I think it has some pretty cool properties, pretty cool biology, very strong, very resilient beetle. And so I want to say that there will always be some beetles that die in the pitch. They can't all swim through. Some of them will probably get stuck there. But if enough of them are able to get into the tree, then we'll have like an infestation or attack, we might say, which I'll show you on the next slide. So, this is another image. This is actually one tree in Massachusetts that I saw attacked by southern pine beetle. And so, I'm gonna go back for a second. As opposed to like the dried up white pitch that we can see on the left, in this slide, here it's kind of more of a reddish color. And I can't tell if that's because, it's probably a different tree species. Like a lot of our images of southern pine beetle attacks traditionally have been from the south, from the loblolly and shortleaf pine. And pitch pine kind of does have a thicker bark, so there's more tree material being pushed out, especially when the southern pine beetles are boring into the tree. So just know that there's some variation there in what it might look like. But so what's happening inside the tree? Southern pine beetles get through the outer bark, then they create what we call galleries in the phloem layer. So some basic tree biology here on the right. They bore through the outer bark and into this like kind of spongy, sugary layer called the phloem, which is between the bark and what we would probably just call like the woody part of the tree, the xylem. Like if you had like firewood, it would probably just be the xylem of the tree. And so over here on the left, we can see these kind of tunnels or like maze-like galleries that the beetles have carved or mined through the phloem. And so the adult beetles are eating that sugary substance, the phloem, and then they're mating, they're laying eggs on either side of the gallery. And you can kind of see a very small image here of some of the larvae that have grown up and they're feeding in the phloem as well. So sometimes it's hard to see if there actually are any like living southern pine beetle larvae or adults inside this bark piece, for example, but you can kind of pick it apart and see if you have anything alive in there. Oh, my arrows keep leaving me. And so just to give you another kind of example of what this will look like, so if you had pitch tubes in a tree or on a tree, I would probably recommend seeing what's going on under the bark. And you can kind of see here when you peel off the bark, you get to see what's underneath. You get to see the galleries. There's also some evidence of those galleries on the xylem face. So on the woody part of the tree, there is some scarring left behind from these galleries. And you can really see in this picture how thick the pitch pine bark is. So the beetles have to go through that to be able to successfully attack the tree. And then kind of zooming out a little bit, some of the signs of decline associated with southern pine beetle will just be the needles of the tree going from green to yellow to orangey to red to completely dried up and falling off the tree. So, and that can happen pretty fast depending on kind of the conditions of the forest, or it may take several months for the needles to fully go through that color change. And really zooming out, this is an image of a big southern pine beetle spot or infestation in the southeastern US. You can see kind of traditionally the southern pine beetle is thought to kind of start in one area, like the center of this image. These trees are all dead pretty much. And then moving outwards, kind of, you can see there's like the orangey needles, the yellow needles of the trees, and some green healthy foliage on the outside of this kind of bullseye effect. So these can be pretty large infestations, and they can spread pretty quickly depending on weather conditions and how warm it is. And so to really kind of integrate the life cycle with what I just talked about with the signs and symptoms, um, here's the basics of southern pine beetle life cycle. So they start off as little eggs. The larvae kind of get bigger and bigger, and they look just kind of what you might traditionally just call like a little grub. Um, and the pupa are kind of like between the larva and adult stage. And main thing I want to stress here is that all of this, the egg to larva to pupa, that's all happening underneath the bark. So if you're only looking at the outside of the tree, walking around the forest, you might see the pitch tubes and you might see some southern pine beetles crawling on the bark if you're, in the forest at the right time of an infestation. And then over here, they're kind of just showing us the difference between a male and a female adult, which you probably cannot see with the naked eye. So don't worry about that part. Um, Likely, I'm thinking based on my conversations with some folks here on this call that there's 3 generations per year in Massachusetts and throughout most of New England. I don't know if we have confirmation on that. I would love to talk about that some more or have a conversation about that. But so this can happen pretty quickly. And southern pine beetle is an insect that it will go through as many life cycles as it can in one year, given the temperature constraints. So it needs to be warm enough for them to be able to grow. And so I've heard stories from the southeastern US where they have like 9, 10 generations per year some years. So this is not something that will only have one life cycle per year, like some, or maybe even longer. Things like emerald ash borer may take up to 2 years to grow fully. Um, but southern pine beetle will do as many as it can. And given our temperatures, I'm thinking 3 generations per year in our region. And so some other signs and symptoms. I think you might be seeing some southern pine beetle associates, other animals associated in the forest with southern pine beetle. So here's some of these key players. You might see some southern pine beetle predators out in the woods, some pretty colorful beetles running along the bark, and they move really fast. It's pretty cool when you get to see them, I think. On the left here, this is called a checkered beetle or a clarid beetle. Kind of has like a red head and thorax, and then some cool zigzags, black and white zigzags on the abdomen or the elytra. This guy Temnotila is like really pretty iridescent green, blue, purple. And these guys both eat southern pine beetles in various life stages. So they'll eat the adults, they'll eat the larvae, they'll eat the eggs, which, this is nature's cleanup crew. We appreciate the work these guys do. Something else you might notice are southern pine beetle parasitoids. So these are wasps that lay their eggs in southern pine beetle larvae. And so some of these wasps are putting their ovipositor, it looks kind of like a stinger, but they can't sting you. They will put that through the bark and into the larvae. How they're able to sense like where exactly the larvae are and pinpoint that through the bark, I am not exactly sure, but it's pretty amazing. So you might see some cool wasp activities on the outside of the bark, and we let those guys go. One other thing you might notice in the forest when you have southern pine beetle infestation is an increase in woodpecker activity. So these are just some different woodpeckers. I don't know all the woodpeckers that are in Massachusetts, but you may notice them really going after the larvae that are in these southern pine beetle trees. So thank you, woodpeckers, for the work that you are doing there. And then lastly, in the associates area here, if you've seen southern pine beetle infestations like through their whole life cycle, now the trees might be on the ground or you've cut down some trees, you might be curious as to why some of the wood looks like it's stained, kind of like black or like dark blue. And this is actually from a fungus. So southern pine beetle often carry the spores of a fungus called blue stain, and they're kind of bringing the spores on their body from tree to tree. And so this actually does stain the wood kind of blue. And kind of fortunately for us, the southern pine beetle larvae do not develop well when this fungus is kind of proliferating through the phloem layer where the larvae are feeding. So seeing the blue stain is a normal thing to see in southern pine beetle infestation areas. And it could possibly also be something that is helping to decrease the southern pine beetle population. Okay, kind of my last piece is going into the outbreak dynamics. Like, why does the population grow so big? And then all of a sudden, sometimes it seems like it just kind of decreases and it's hard to find the beetles, which happened to me a little bit during the first year I was studying them. Of course, I couldn't find the thing that I was trying to study. So once again, we have our little beetle here. It's tiny. And once the adult beetles are boring into the trees, they're eating the pine trees. Then they're going to start producing some pheromones. So this one's called frontalin, and as far as I can tell, the pheromones come out of their butt. And so other beetles are going to smell this pheromone, and they're going to be attracted to this kind of region of southern pine beetle activity. Like, wow, okay, somebody else is eating the pine tree. I should go there too. And they're sensing the pheromone with their antenna, the part of the top part of their antenna, which is very intricate when you zoom in. And so what I'm trying to show here is that southern pine beetle use pheromone communication to really stage these mass attacks. So they're able to communicate so they can work together to kill the tree because just one beetle can't do it. And so what this kind of looks like in a brief animation, we have one beetle, they're eating the tree, they produce their pheromones, more beetles arrive, they do the same thing. And then it kind of becomes this big party in the woods, right? There's tons of beetles, there's lots of pheromones, and that's kind of what's allowing for the population to get really large and for them to really focus on particular trees. And so two main factors really influence southern pine beetle population growth. Obviously, they need to be able to survive the coldest night of the year. Will they survive? That's the question. And then we also need to know like what is there for the beetles to eat. There obviously needs to be host trees. There needs to be a place for the next generation to grow up. And so in my mind, I'm thinking about like how many trees are there? What is their density? So to kind of allow that outbreak to happen, we basically just need the beetles to be able to survive and have enough food. And so briefly into the temperature piece, the temperature on the coldest night of the year determines how many southern pine beetles survive the winter. So at about -7 Fahrenheit, on this graph over here, we would expect that about 90% of southern pine beetles will die. And now the next part is kind of, I think, the most interesting. Oh, I animated this wrong. But to put this into perspective of some Massachusetts places, this was the temperature on January 31st, 2026, this past winter. Seemed to be the coldest night of the year throughout the whole region. In Plymouth, got down to -7. We would expect that 90% of beetles died. In Edgartown, it got down to about -2. About 65% of southern pine beetles would have died. In Falmouth and Bourne, it got down to about 1 degree Fahrenheit. We would expect 47% mortality. And on Nantucket, the lowest temperature was 9. So we would expect that maybe 20% of beetles died. Nantucket seemed like a big outlier. I'm not entirely sure. Based on all the weather data I was able to find, that's what I found. So if somebody else has more data on that, I'd be interested. But we can kind of see here that the places where there is warmer winters, we have more southern pine beetles, more southern pine beetle activity, at least has been reported. So that kind of goes with what we know about southern pine beetle biology. And so to kind of tee Kevin up in the management portion coming soon, I'm thinking about what forest conditions allow southern pine beetles to thrive. So when we have lots of host trees close together or high pine density, that's a perfect situation for southern pine beetle. It's kind of like being in a buffet, like lots and lots of food resources are there for the beetles. And if these host trees are stressed and not able to respond so much to the attacks, that's even better for the beetles. So I think in Kevin's management talk, we'll hear a little bit more about what we can do to manage forest conditions, increase individual tree health, decrease their stress, and what you can actually do to kind of change forest conditions. And so just to stress, forest management decreases their pitch pine density and increases individual tree health. And so with that, I thank you for your time. I hope I gave you a good primer on southern pine beetle biology, and I can take your questions. I see one thing in the chat. Danielle says the temperature sounds right for Nantucket. Cool. All right.
Are there any other questions for Caroline? We have a couple minutes, so
Yeah, we have till 9:40, I believe. So
yes, we have 3 minutes.
I will say, talking to the folks in Nantucket, when we first saw that outbreak, they said they hadn't seen a frost in years.
on
So
Nantucket. Wow.
yeah, and that was, I believe, 2023 when they said that.
Yeah. Oh, to go into some questions here, Violet says, any reports of them going into other pine species up north? I don't think I have that information. We've seen them going into red pine a couple times, I believe. Norway spruce, I think. But kind of in northern New England, the other species that we'd be concerned about would be red pine and also jack pine. I don't think that we have any information about southern pine beetle interacting with jack pine yet.
And white pine, Caroline?
And white pine as well, yes. And just to stress, kind of, it seems like in our region, the trees that are not pitch pine are more of a spillover host. So once the population gets big enough, they're looking for any food possible. They're not being quite so picky. Savannah says, why do they want the trees to be dead? Well, the beetles really don't. They want kind of a very fresh tree. They want that phloem layer to be pretty moist, because if it's dried up, the larvae will not survive. So the beetles don't necessarily want the tree to die. They want the tree to allow them inside, but as a product of their activities, the tree will most likely die. Um, Isabel asks, are the parasitoid and predator communities in New England the same as those in the South? Kind of. There's a lot of very similar species. Some species are present, like seems like from Maine down to the Carolinas, for example. Or other species, it seems like, there's one in New England and there might be one down in Louisiana, for example. So very similar roles played out there. David asks if the blue stain fungus is a viable threat to southern pine beetle. Could it be a treatment? It does damage the host trees. So the blue stain fungus is not a good thing if you're a pine tree. It seems like the blue fungus could be like a natural regulator of southern pine beetle dynamics, but it's pretty complicated and pretty interesting. So I don't think we could just add more fungi and then get rid of the beetles. Claire says there were some initial attacks in Connecticut in red pine, Norway spruce, Scots pine, but nothing since. Tucker asks, how far can an individual adult disperse? That's a great question. So beetles can fly, obviously. We know that they can disperse probably a couple kilometers, so maybe a mile and a half, a couple miles, based on how far the H1 can fly. However, they're so small and light that they are able to move with the wind. So in big storm events, for example, southern pine beetles maybe move from place to place. And probably last question for me, James asked, does each generation move to a new tree or can multiple generations use the same tree? That's a great question. Yeah, each generation will use a new tree. Kind of once once a beetle comes out of a tree, it's kind of going to go outwards towards another tree, and it's very unlikely that a new generation of beetles will come out of a tree and their host tree will be in good enough condition for them. So they'll probably be looking for something new. Great questions, everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for asking the questions. And Caroline, thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge that you have gained both through your research and also through your help in studying and helping us manage southern pine beetle. So
yeah, happy to be here. Thanks everyone.
But it's 9:40, so Kevin Dodds is up and he's going to share about southern pine beetle management opportunities in pitch pine. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you. And if other people have any questions, please continue to put them in the chat and we can answer them as we go. And we'll also put some resources in the chat as well related that we have posted on the NAFSE website that support all the information that's being shared today. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. And can you see everything all right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yep, perfect.
All right. Well, thanks, Caroline. You set this up really well. And I'm gonna just really provide some information on forest management options for southern pine beetle, really to we're trying to reduce obviously the impacts, but at the same time it often provides an opportunity to just improve stand resilience in some of these pitch pine stands that have been unmanaged for a long time. So in a way, a positive spin on southern pine beetle in these forests. Oh, let's see, why am I not moving? There we go. All right. So Caroline touched on some of these, but there are some pretty important biological factors related to management that southern pine beetle has. The first one is that it really is a primary tree killer. In terms of bark beetles, we don't have any of those in the Northeast. Spruce beetle would be the closest thing, and those outbreaks are pretty rare nowadays. But southern pine beetle is very aggressive, more aggressive than anything else we have, even probably compared to emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, some of our invasive species. So, and it really thrives in hard pine. Caroline mentioned the southern species that it does really well in. Fortunately, up here for New England and New York broadly, hard pines aren't really a dominant forest type, but in Massachusetts and certainly on the Cape and some other areas, they're an important, very important tree species, and that's where southern pine beetles doing some damage. It does form these infestations, and because of the multiple generations, and I agree with Caroline that 3 to 4 generations per year makes sense. But you get a situation where that initial attack that forms the initial infestation, those multiple generations just keep emerging from those trees and attacking adjacent trees. And that's why you see these spots or infestations grow throughout the summer and into the fall. Now we've even seen some spot growth into November and December, unfortunately, on Long Island. It really, this whole attack sequence, as Caroline talked about, it's really kind of moderated by this effective pheromone system. So, that draws beetles in through the mass attack with the diagram that Caroline showed. But then also there's other pheromones that sort of shut down that attack in an individual tree and shift those beetles to the surrounding trees. So that's why beetles sort of stay local in the summer, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Obviously limited by winter temperatures, and we had hoped early on when Long Island was first getting attacks that we had cold enough winters in Massachusetts and further north to maybe slow and limit spread, but more and more we're getting release from those winter temperatures, and that's just effectively opening up more habitat on the landscape for southern pine beetle to exploit, unfortunately. And so there's a couple different factors, that influence southern pine beetle populations. I just broke this out quickly to abiotic and biotic. Obviously we talked about the cold winter temperatures in the south. Also, heat can be a problem and for developing brood. And then drought and soil and site conditions, kind of lump those together for southern pine beetle, and that they can have an effect on host trees and that resin defense that Caroline talked about. Biotic, the predators and parasitoids are important. The fungal associates, Caroline mentioned blue stain, and that's kind of seen as antagonistic for southern pine beetle. But southern pine beetle also carries beneficial fungi that help support growth or feed the developing brood, and so they're beneficial to the beetle. But it does seem like blue stain is sort of benefit for us to see at higher levels in trees because you tend to see the brood do much worse. But as Caroline mentioned, it is considered a defect in some situations for the wood products. Um, and then, host tree conditions, the big thing, and we'll get into that more about management. But, if you have lowish or lower endemic populations of southern pine beetle and you have healthy trees, more times than not, the tree will win over the attacking beetles. If you have, moderate to high populations and weakened trees, then those trees are easily exploited by southern pine beetle. Just a few things about host selection dispersal that kind of come into play when you think about management. Host selection, there's no evidence of primary attraction, and all that means is that southern pine beetle is not a beetle that looks for stressed trees. It does well in stressed forests, but if you have a weakened pine tree in the spring or the summer, that does not mean it's going to be attacked by southern pine beetle. And so, I'm going to talk about management more in a second, but all these things that we do to make the most resilient pitch pine forest, you could still have attacked trees in there, but you really shouldn't see an infestation grow. So it's a little nuance, but it's something that is important when you start thinking, and especially when you start seeing attacked trees in different areas. It really selects trees randomly, as far as we can tell. There was a lot of work, in the 80s and early 90s on this. So, everything's not figured out about this, but essentially, pioneer beetles are dispersing, they're finding these trees, and then at some point, they accept them and start releasing those pheromones. In terms of dispersal, and this is also important because of the behavior, and this ties into the infestation growth. But so, in the spring, you've got beetles coming out of their overwintering hosts, and they're sort of geared towards long range dispersal to find that next host tree and start an infestation. But then in the summer, the physiology of the beetle is a little bit different. They don't have as much fat reserves, typically, anyways. And so the beetles don't disperse. They're more inclined to stay local and grow that infestation. And so it's thought that only a small percentage of the population in the summer coming out of any tree each generation are long range dispersers. So that's why you see this expansion of these infestations. And then I think in the fall, we've been learning more up here, just with some of our trapping than probably what's typically known in the South. But um, I think, generally it was thought that in the fall it was a mix of long range dispersal and short range. And I think certainly we've been able to see through trapping that long range dispersal is occurring. But we also see spot growth going through into the fall too, which would suggest short range. So combination of those both, which I think probably makes sense. So before we jump into management, I just wanted to talk about healthy pitch pine forests. I think probably most of us on the call know what these are when we see them, but there's a lot of variation in pitch pine, and I sort of switch between pitch pine barrens and pitch pine forests and use those interchangeably. But there's variation in conditions in terms of the stocking, the residual basal area, the conditions of those forests. But generally speaking, these forests are open canopies and have a pretty developed understory. And so you're getting, a situation. So in the understory, you might have scrub oak, you might have blueberry, huckleberry, things like that. And the really important component if you want to maintain pitch pine, is to have disturbance in there. And so generally that's prescribed fire that allows pitch pine to regenerate in there and maintain that forest type. And so but within the range, you have a lot of options. You can have a very open pine barrens, sort of the traditional view of a pine barrens, to a forest that has a more complete canopy, but is still, in terms of forest ecology or forestry, would be considered pretty open. All right, so jumping into the management tools. So we've really relied on three tools up here. Detection and monitoring. I'm not going to go into that really, but that's provided us a lot of information to and knowledge on where the beetle is and where we should start thinking about working or managing for it. What I'm going to focus on today is spot disruption, which is commonly referred to as suppression treatments. And that's a tool to kind of attack these active infestations. And then preventative silviculture treatments. And that's where we really think the most benefit is getting these forests in a condition where they can, handle southern pine beetle moving through. We won't have large scale tree losses. And then it also provides some flexibility and timing of treatments and coming up with plans instead of just being reactive all the time. Oh, there's some other management tools you'll come across when you're, online or looking at some of the literature. Pesticides, not a viable option in the forest for sure, but something that, can be used sometimes for individual tree protection, but you have a very narrow window of when to use those for full protection. Anti-attractants are using the pheromones that the beetle has against them. Verbenone is a beetle pheromone, and then also GLVs, which are green leaf volatiles that mimic hardwood trees mostly. And those we've had some success out west with anti-attractants, but been very, very inconsistent with southern pine beetle. So it's not a tool that at this time we recommend. And then biocontrol, Caroline stressed that, southern pine beetle is native, and that is very important to sort of go into this with that understanding. So there's already a community of predators and parasitoids that were here. There's probably some that may move in too as climate continues to warm. So something like classical biocontrol, where you would be, moving predators into new areas to go after southern pine beetle, would not be something we would be interested in. Same with augmentative, where you're sort of supplementing populations, and there's been some attempts at that with I think breeding some of the predators and then also feeding parasitoids so that they lay more eggs on infested trees. And then conservation biocontrol, there is a window for that, right? And trees that had southern pine beetle earlier in the season that then emerge and move on to other trees, those emerged trees are filled with predators and parasitoids and competitors, which we haven't really talked about, which are really important too. And so if you can keep those, if you're going in to do suppression or management, if you can keep those trees standing for a year or so without any hazard to trails or anything like that, that is beneficial. All right, so just to move into actual active management, so the disruption of current infestations, it's important to understand the mechanism here. It's really disrupting the pheromone plumes and the communication. Southern pine beetle mortality in these treatments is minimal. You get something like 80% or more survival of the beetles, but you're cutting out all of the pheromones. That's what you're hoping to do so that the beetles cannot locate their next tree to attack. The emerging southern pine beetle that survive the tree felling are then dispersed on the landscape. And it's thought that since they're not really in a condition for long range dispersal, that most of those just die before they could either join another infestation or initiate. And a really important consideration over the last couple of years is that, this is really a growing season treatment. And that becomes really important when you start thinking about wildlife habitat considerations. Northern long-eared bats are, in their breeding season, coincides with when you would want to be doing these disruption and suppression cuts. And so you can't always do that depending on the property ownership and things like that. So, it's a reactive and you're on the timeline of the beetle, and that doesn't always mesh with some of the other things we have to balance. And there's no evidence that that disruption, cutting these spots down increases spots or spot proliferation, right? So like I said already, I mean, those beetles are not really thought to be able to initiate other infestations because they're just physiologically, they don't have a lot of fat reserves and they're not in that physiological state. And just a diagram, just sort of a schematic to show this. There's two methods, right, to suppression or disruption, and that's cut and leave and cut and remove. And the only difference is, cut and leave, you're leaving all of the wood in the forest. With cut and remove, you're pulling all that material out if you have a market or if you can use it somewhere else. And so in these diagrams, the yellow trees are the currently infested, southern pine beetle infested trees. The black trees are trees that were attacked, maybe earlier in the spring and are emerged. These are the ones that you would want to leave standing if possible. And then these border trees would be, if you're out in the woods, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell if they were attacked or not, right? So those are the green trees with the black lines. So we call that the green tree buffer. And you have to cut those too because you don't know if they're a source for pheromones or not. They probably are. So in both of these treatments, with cut and leave, you just drop all the trees back on themselves and then walk away. And cut and remove, you take all of that material out, to somewhere else to use it, or if there's a market that can be sold to. So I think, Long Island, it's all been cut and leave. And I think for the most part in Massachusetts, that'll be the situation too. And there are some important considerations, and I think the first one is infestation size. So if if you're a landowner and you find an infestation that is 50 trees or less, and it's the growing season, if there's a lot more potential for growth, and it's a high hazard stand, then you probably want to try to disrupt that. But if you find it and it's, 100 or 200 trees, it may be beyond what you can effectively or successfully suppress or disrupt. And then season's important too. It really is growing season, so June to now I would have used to say, August, but we've all seen a lot of spot expansion into the fall too. But I think as you get later in the season, it's probably less effective, or at least economically, you're probably not getting as much bang for your buck by suppressing those infestations and just letting them go because they are going to shut down over the winter. And then, what we really, again, like I said at the beginning, is, what we really want to move towards is just reducing susceptibility in pine stands across the landscape through silvicultural treatments. And, this gives us the most flexibility timing wise. It allows, good management plans to be developed, or layering what we know about southern pine beetle on top of all of the great, restoration efforts that are already occurring on the landscape. And really you want to take, stand like the top image there and move it, whether your focus is reducing southern pine beetle susceptibility, which is, the last 10 years or so up here, or you want to, restore and then manage and maintain that stand, which is decades of work up here. Either way, the exact treatments meet those goals. And so those two pictures at the bottom are the same picture because those same conditions do both. They reduce susceptibility and they improve, forest conditions, and they're the goal often for restoration and maintenance and management. So it's one of those unusual situations where two sort of objectives can use the same tools. We don't often find that with pest management or probably with forest management either. So it's important to understand that, the southern pine beetle is just responding to what is on the landscape. So it's a bark beetle, it's doing bark beetle things, and they're going after stressed forests. So unmanaged pitch pine is essentially optimal southern pine beetle habitat. When you look at a forest like that on the right, that is perfect for southern pine beetle. I look at that and I know there's going to be an infestation in there that can grow really readily, and it's going to be a problem. And that's because it's a closed canopy. It has that high stem density, and then, very high basal areas. And, we look at anything over 100 square feet of basal area as you're getting into, high hazard. But, that stand probably is 160 or 180 even in some areas. And so, forests that are very, very stressed that, once southern pine beetle finds it, they can do very well in it. And then, contrary to that, managed pitch pine is very poor southern pine beetle habitat. It's essentially hostile and a hostile environment, and we want to move forests towards that as much as possible. And it's because the open canopy makes it difficult for the pheromones to function the same way for the beetle. So the beetle has a harder time tracking those pheromones. The larger intertree distances between these trees makes it when one generation moves out of the tree and starts dispersing, they may not run into that tree and they just then disperse out or keep flying. So those are two benefits that we get from these this type of management in pitch pine. And generally, we're talking about basal area of less than, 80 square feet. Caroline showed that great aerial shot of Waterboro Pine Barrens, and that thinned area, that's at about 80, compared to those dense areas, which are probably 140 or so. And so we, some of the work that Tony D'Amato and one of his graduate students, Elizabeth Jameson, that worked with us, they sort of tease us apart a little bit more, and we're looking really at getting below 60 is where you really start to see the benefit of reducing basal area to improving stand resilience and lowering susceptibility to southern pine beetle. So, but 80's great. Getting down to 80, if that's where you can go, is really, really helpful. Getting lower is important too. And you see we work in some stands that have 15 square feet of basal area, very open pine barren. Some of the stuff that we've seen on Miles Standish that look incredible. Low susceptibility stands. So when we move these stands to be low susceptibility or low hazard, depending on your terminology, it does not mean that we won't get attacked trees, though, right? This stand should just not grow an infestation, but because the beetle randomly attacks, we could see some hits here and there, and we've seen that on Long Island. And Caroline touched on a lot of this too. And there's sort of two things that come into play when you thin. And I think the one that we all jump to, and I certainly did when I was learning this stuff, is that you're thinning the forest. The residual trees are going to be healthier. They have more resources. We would hope that they would then have improved host defenses too. But the truth of it is the real mechanism we think that really lowers susceptibility to southern pine beetle is the differences in the stand structure, and that you're disrupting pheromones. And so the pheromones get disrupted horizontally, so the beetles have a harder time following them. And then on a warm day, you can get this like chimney effect, essentially, where the pheromones get blown up and out. So makes it much harder for that important biological factor for southern pine beetle to the pheromone system to be able to track to other trees. And then there is a benefit, though, for sure, from increased resin defense. So again, if you have really healthy trees and moderate to low populations, there's a lot of times where the tree's going to win and they're going to shut down that infestation. But there's also times where, no matter how healthy, you could have the healthiest tree out there and southern pine beetle populations are high, they're going to overwhelm that tree and kill it. So, but it is a added benefit of the thinning for sure. Okay, so just to summarize and pull this together, southern pine beetle, it's here to stay. It's going to be a consistent threat. As long as we have unmanaged pitch pine on the landscape, there's going to be habitat for southern pine beetle. And so it's just something that we're going to have to live with now. Spot disruption is effective for smaller infestations. And, if the time's right, it's a really good tool to be able to go in and knock things down, but it's not. There's so many limits with it, especially with timing on state and federal land, that it may not be a tool that we can use as much as we want to. And then it's just important to know that, southern pine beetle just exploits available habitat. And as long as those conditions exist, we'll have areas that southern pine beetle can hit as long as there's not some, crazy change in winter temperatures starting to drop. But the good news is, right, that all of this habitat can be manipulated, and there's long-standing and tested, restoration, forest management efforts in pitch pine that align with southern pine beetle prevention. So it's been a really good situation from a forest entomologist point of view up here, in that we didn't have to start anything from scratch. There were people that have been working on pitch pine, for decades in Massachusetts, some on Long Island, even, going up into Ospey pine barrens in New Hampshire and Waterboro pine barrens. So a lot of information out there that was really helpful for us to kind of bring into our management plans. And that's really it. I don't know if I have time for questions. These are just some of the sites that we've been fortunate enough to work in. You can see some of the variation in conditions, Miles Standish being the least dense of any of these, but Brookhaven on Long Island after a prescribed fire, Waterboro on the ground. Waterboro is a cool site because it's kind of hilly. And then this is our demo site on Long Island. So with that, Polly, if I have questions, I'm happy to take them. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see things normally. Polly, I guess, let's see, are there any questions?
Sorry, I was muted. Nathan had asked if decimated stands eventually regenerate pitch pine, or do SPD continually infest saplings as they grow?
Yeah, that's a good question with a lot of nuance to it. So generally speaking, a stand that's attacked by southern pine beetle, the condition in a lot of the stands, there is no pitch pine regeneration. So once those overstory trees are dead, there's pitch pines mostly gone from there, unless unless we get lucky that there is some regen or there's some type of restoration. Um, you know, and so that's sort of another angle of why it's important to thin and restore these stands, because by doing that, you reinitiate those understories, right? So then you do have saplings of sapling-sized pitch pine that if you lose the overstory, those trees move, have the opportunity to move into the overstory. But we're missing that in a lot of the areas. And the sapling size thing's interesting. If you had to ask that question 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said, no, they can't really go into anything, under an inch or whatever. But we saw that type of material attacked on Brookhaven, 2-3 years ago now, probably, where southern pine beetle was just going into everything. So it's not a habitat that could produce beetles, or sustain an infestation, but that material could be killed by southern pine beetle.
Claire had just commented on the basal area greater than 100 square feet per acre, whether that's just pitch or all trees together. And Jake did elaborate and clarify that it's all trees together,
Yep.
related to the pheromone dispersal.
Yep.
Dispersion. So, does anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, we can turn it over to Rob and Cole. We are running a little behind, so.
Cool.
Yep.
Thanks, Polly.
Okay, great. Continue to put questions in the chat. So, well, next up is Rob Cole and Jess Cancelleri from Forest Health in DEC out of New York State. They're with the Division of Lands and Forests, and they have been on the forefront of southern pine beetle management and leading the charge both for southern pine beetle, but also encouraging the active forest management, both preventative and suppression. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
Can you see?
I'm seeing your what do you call not your full screen, but your yes, presenter view.
Did I fix
Perfect.
it? Okay.
Yes.
Thank
Yep,
you.
you're good.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to just provide a little bit of context and background on like the initial response on Long Island. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges we faced, the decisions we made, lessons learned, and then I'm going to pass it over to Rob to kind of dive deeper into the management and the day-to-day operations on the ground on Long Island. So, Southern Pine Beetle was first discovered on Long Island in 2014. Initial reports of extensive tree mortality started in Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge on the south shore of the island. And by the time Southern Pine Beetle was confirmed there, we estimated that there were probably over 100,000 trees dead. Um, it was just really clear to all of us from the start how fast this beetle moved and how much potential it had to cause significant damage. We knew we had a big problem on our hands. Initial aerial surveys that fall in the next spring revealed about 10,000 acres of damage spread across eastern Long Island, mostly concentrated in the Central Pine Barrens Preserve, which you can see on the map in the upper left. The Central Pine Barrens is one of the largest contiguous pitch pine and scrub oak ecosystems in the Northeast that still remain. And as Kevin mentioned, this system was primed for exactly this kind of outbreak. Decades of fire suppression, lack of forest management had created these dense, stressed, closed canopy pitch pine forests that provided perfect conditions for southern pine beetle. So when SPB showed up, we were fortunate to have a playbook, right? Like thanks to the decades of extensive research in the South and a group of researchers and land managers from the South who were more than willing to share their expertise with us. So while we benefited greatly from that, there were a lot of things that we weren't sure about. We didn't know if things would play out similarly in New York and in the North than as they did in the South, and what exactly might be different. So we had a lot of questions, and we also felt some urgency to respond quickly, to do something, especially given the extensive tree mortality and the rapid pace of it. The infestation spanned many land ownerships, so one of the first things we did was set up an incident command system, a slightly modified incident command system, because we knew this wasn't something that one agency could deal with alone. So we brought together municipal, state, federal partners and built an organizational structure. And I'd say the main pillars of our program at the time focused on survey, some monitoring through trapping, suppression, outreach, and even research to some degree. So of course, survey told us where the beetle was and how fast it was moving. Suppression got crews on the ground, cutting and removing infested trees, trying to slow the spread and stay on top of it, which proved to be very difficult. Outreach meant that we were reaching private landowners, town officials, and the public because most of this infestation was on land not within our jurisdiction. Um, our initial research was focused on trying to understand what might be different in the North and what were the management implications of those differences. So, what did overwintering mortality look like on Long Island? What's the phenology here? When do beetles emerge? Is it the same as in the South? How many generations a year do we have? How fast does it take for our major hosts to succumb to southern pine beetle? Can SPB populations be sustained in alternate hosts like white pine? And so on. So so this new problem of southern pine beetle posed a lot of issues that needed addressing. And I guess one lesson that I would pass on is this, that you don't want to wait till the outbreak is out of control before you build your team. The ICS structure gave us a common language and sort of a common framework and purpose across agencies that normally operate in silos. And that coordination was quite effective early on in the response. I will say as time went on, we sort of narrowed the ICS structure as agencies kind of honed in on their own priorities and their own management strategies, that split up a little bit. And in the end, our ICS structure kind of became smaller. In the end, it was like DEC and the Central Pine Barrens Commission and the Forest Service. So it did shrink over time. But initially, that coordination was extremely important. So, one thing I want to talk about was the impact to homeowners and communities, because when we focus on management, sometimes that's something that's lost. And for any, especially like state program managers, it may be something that you encounter. So DEC management efforts have always focused entirely on public lands. And so private landowners were and still are left to manage southern pine beetle impacts on their own. Uh, when outbreaks flared, especially the pictures you're looking at right now were from a large outbreak on the South Fork of Long Island in East Hampton that just devastated communities, removed 100% overstory in many communities. So when the outbreak came about, the most immediate challenge for homeowners was hazard tree removal. People were losing tons of trees. Um, but Long Island municipalities required permits to remove trees, like even on private property. And you could get fines of up to 10 grand for non-compliance with that. And, southern pine beetle kills a tree in weeks. So permit processes were like not built for that timeline at all. And the result was that these ordinances that were designed to protect trees ended up delaying removal of the very trees that needed to come down the fastest. So that was tough. Another challenge was the immense financial burden placed on homeowners. While some state funding was provided, through the years to municipalities, there was never a direct public assistance program available to help residents manage the tree loss and the, high costs associated with it. The only notable relief effort that I ever heard about was in the town of East Hampton following the severe outbreak, when homeowners were still responsible for paying for tree removal, but the town provided a waiver for the disposal fees at the local transfer station. But because of like most of the affected trees were mature, these costs to remove them were really high, like usually a minimum of $2,000 per tree. And so certain groups were hit exceptionally hard by these costs. I remember talking to a lot of elderly residents at the time living on fixed incomes, and it was just impossible for them, and the limited relief available did really little to offset the true costs and the financial impact. And that's a problem that we still haven't quite been able to solve. In New York, it's much harder. We just have a lot of bureaucratic limitations to like cost assistance programs and things like that, like they have in the South. So a little bit about suppression. So using the Southern playbook, we jumped immediately into suppression early on as our primary management response, mostly because we had to get out there and do something. And because it was just like, there was beetles everywhere and dead trees everywhere. It was a very natural reactive response, right? We weren't at that point thinking about restoration. We were just trying to deal with like what was on our plates at the moment. So one of the first decisions we had to make was what to do with the trees once we left them. And the answer pretty quickly became that we had to leave them on site. And so we went forth using cut and leave predominantly or exclusively. In the southern pine plantations, the cut and remove strategy is more often used. Timber gets salvaged, hauled out, and sold. And those profits can offset the cost of management, right? But we didn't have that option. There was no commercial market for pitch pine on Long Island. And getting wood off an island, the trucking, the logistics, the sheer volume was impossible, if not extraordinarily expensive. So cut and leave became our only option. And there was another problem layered on top of that, which was that we were only suppressing on state lands or public lands. So the Pine Barrens are a patchwork that includes state land, municipal, private land, all mixed together. So when neighboring properties weren't doing suppression, we were essentially treating one piece of a connected forest in isolation. And, beetles don't abide by property lines. So suppressed areas could easily get reinfested within the same season from adjacent land that we had no authority over. So, we did our best to make the approach work. We did a lot of experimentation with Kevin in the Forest Service. We experimented with timing, different treatments, different cutting approaches, looking for ways to reduce beetle survival in the down material. Some of it was promising in theory, but did not make enough of a difference in reality. And then the northern long-eared bat was listed as endangered, which added further restrictions on where and when we could operate. So our window for suppression kept getting narrower, and meanwhile, infestations kept multiplying. So they were too numerous, too spread out, too moving too fast for us to keep up with. And that's when we started shifting gears and started looking harder at prevention and restoration tactics, which Rob will go into more detail on shortly. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that's sort of like the arc of the last 12 years, from kind of scrambling to respond to recognizing that the real work is long-term restoration. You can't suppress your way out of an outbreak, and the path forward is truly a healthier forest. So I'll pass it over to Rob now to talk a little bit more about maybe some of the suppression challenges and the restoration work that he's managing today.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jess.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. So, just taking a little bit of a step back into history, what were the Long Island Pine Barrens? So, when we think of pine barrens today, oftentimes we're still picturing these closed canopy forests or um, maybe semi-open, but we actually have these photos. These were from a bulletin put out by New York State on forestry in 1920. So these pictures are maybe a couple years old at this point, um, that they're taken. But you can see Long Island's wastes, barren wastes, are a result of successive forest fires. And then under the bottom picture, planted pine trees will thrive on Long Island when fire is kept out. So this is what the situation we had. It was determined that this was not what we wanted at some point. Um, uh, in the early 1900s, New York was mostly deforested, so there was a huge push to reforest, and maybe some of it was a little misguided on the location. So, but you can see historically, the Pine Barrens of New York probably were not great southern pine beetle habitat. So, um, we may not be going this barren in some of our work, but this is the direction that we're headed with some of our restorations. So next slide, please. Jess, thank you. Okay, so a little bit more current picture of what's going on here. So on the left side of the picture, to the left of the trail and that dead tree that's right in the center, is an area where we have done some treatment. And on the right side of the picture is more representative of current conditions. And so, as you can see, we are going through and doing a considerable amount of thinning. And so that's both overstory removal and understory removal, specifically scrub oak. You can look in that stand and see you can't see 15 feet into the stand before you hit a wall of scrub oak. It's very dark and dense. And of course, as we've heard, these are the great conditions for southern pine beetle. Whereas if we get to things on like it is on the left, those pheromone plumes disperse and the beetles don't uh, see one another. So next slide. So on top of okay, so yeah, we're going into this a little bit more detail. Sorry. So I mentioned that scrub oak, and these are untreated stands, and that scrub oak is anywhere from 8 to 12 feet tall. So one thing we need to do is go in with a forestry mower, which we purchased. We went with a skid steer mounted unit. We bought the skid steer as well. So to start getting into these scrub oak treatments to open up the stands, like you see in the upper right-hand picture, that was about a $185,000 investment in equipment, and we have our staff run that. If you don't have staff, so we have a technician who runs that. That's pretty much her full-time job. Probably about 75% of her time is spent on that machine doing mowing. And you can see the results are great. 3 months after treatment, things are greening up on the ground. You have your shrub layer coming back. It's certainly not killing it. It's not going away. Um, so we're doing this work in-house. Like I said, we invested the 185,000 to buy the machine, and we have a technician kind of dedicated to this. We have looked into doing contracts, mowing this kind of scrub oak and small pitch pine. And the prices we get back right now on this type of work are $5,000 or $6,000 an acre, right? So again, Jess mentioned the difficulty of removing trees and getting things off the island. well, even getting people to come to the island and do work is extremely expensive. So um, I think we, like Jess mentioned, we started with suppression and we were kind of splitting our time. We didn't start the restoration kind of work like you see in this slide until 2018, which was 3 years into things. But yeah, maybe, I think focusing your energy, you either have to have an immense amount of resources so you can do both suppression or the restoration side of things, or you have to pick one. And of course, I think what we're hearing in the long run, picking the restoration side of things over suppression, probably is the way to go. So next slide, please. So I just really wanted to show quickly, the pheromone plume dispersal is really awesome. It's great. But if you're managing these stands, like the one on the right side of your screen at the Albany Pine Bush, you can see so our lab has been collecting some data on predators and competitors of southern pine beetle. So you can see in these really well managed open stands, the predator totals, the scale on that I have circled there is, up to 1,500. And then you go to some other locations that are less managed and further dense, and you'll see that scale on that graph only goes to 650. They have, a third of the predators on the landscape. They have maybe a similar number of competitors, but really that predator total is really impressive. So not only are we dispersing the pheromone, but we're getting into bringing in those other biocontrols, like Kevin mentioned earlier. Next slide. So, like I mentioned, we started our forest management in 2018, actually maybe 2017, we got a little bit of it started here. So it's a very long process. We're having to pay to do all of this. Um, right now, our tree cutting, um, we can't exactly afford tree cutting at the moment. We're working on getting a new contract, but to thin about the 500 acres that you see here in the various colors on your map, that cost us a little over $1 million, and that was cut and leave. So we had to pay somebody to cut and drop the trees. So for us, funding is a big thing. We're constantly working on getting additional funding sources because the work isn't cheap. I mentioned we were kind of splitting our time between doing suppression and these forest treatments, these thinnings. Uh, Again, I think, looking back, I probably would have put more effort into these thinnings now as opposed to the direct suppression because we can never really keep up with it. And we kind of talked about that's come up in the other talks is the speed at which southern pine beetle moves. So you can see this map and kind of all the statistics here. Um, Things other than thinning that we have to do. I mentioned the mowing. You don't want to leave a ton of material on the ground here. These are pitch pine barrens. So you got to get in there with fire or you got to get in there and chip stuff up. If you make chips, you got to get the chipper out. So these are all things we've been doing in-house because contracting them on Long Island is extremely difficult and extremely expensive. And one of the other big things that we're working on also is invasive species management because you're going to be opening up the canopy and, there's going to be a lot of great barrens plants, hopefully that pop up that are in the seed bank, but you may also have some invasives in your seed bank or you may have invasives blowing in. So that's a huge thing you gotta keep track of. But in this area, we have it thin now down to that 80 square feet or less across this 500 acres. And we have had some areas where southern pine beetle has moved in, but it hasn't gone wild and taken out, hundreds and hundreds of trees because again, the pheromone plume moves through and doesn't really allow them to super mass tack. So next slide, please. One of the other things we're doing other than the ecological management is kind of this fire management. It is all tied together. So if we're going to do this restoration work, one thing that can really screw that up is getting a wildfire through there. beforehand. While they can be good to open the area up, oftentimes we're seeing, these long-lasting fire scars where the ground is really scorched and things aren't growing and things aren't coming back at a pace or species aren't coming back that we need. So we really on Long Island are looking to avoid wildfires, also because we have a lot of people down there. So we're kind of following this kind of thin and burn uh, line of pictures that you see in the middle so that we can avoid ground fires and avoid crown fires and keep everything out of the canopy. And so some of the ways you see our mower there and our staff with chainsaws. One thing we're doing because these stands are really dense is we can't go in and necessarily remove all the trees at once and bring it down to a super thin basal area. So it's making it hard to get in there and do a lot of burning at the moment because we have some trees on the ground but close canopies. So you can see in that center picture there, we're actually doing a lot of pile burning. We've burned about over 300 piles now at Sarnoff, just trying to get material out of there so that we can have better access for doing actual prescribed burns. And then we have been burning. We're starting to get into the woodlands down there, um, and starting to restore some of those with fire. Next slide, Jess. So this is Sarnoff again. You can see the areas highlighted in yellow. Those are our urban areas. This is the WUI. And those red areas point um, the direction of historical fire movement through our state forest there. And you can see kind of the light patch right in the center that I have outlined with a green line. It kind of blends in there. I was trying to highlight it a little bit. But you notice that's a lot thinner through that area. And then to the north part of it, you'll see the stands look brown, and those are areas that we have burned. So that picture on the right is actually taken in that center burned area. So the idea being that if we had one of these wildfires come through, not only have we thinned this whole area for southern pine beetle purposes and restoring the pine barrens, and so we're going to get all those benefits, but also if history repeats itself, which we know it does, and a fire moves from the southwest, uh, we will now have protected those communities because we've thinned it out. Any crown fires will drop to the ground. And then once they're on the ground, you can see in that picture, we've burned there, so there's not a lot of fuel. The idea, we drop that fire down to the ground, it starts moving real slow and we can easily put it out. So, yeah, wrapping it all up, the fire management and the ecosystem management and health and safety, they're kind of the solutions or the best thing for all of those is the same, and that, with the thinning, which is really awesome. So next slide, Jess. Just some more pictures here. You can see we're burning there in the upper left and what it looks like after the fact. The trees turn a little brown, but they're living. They love it. They're there having a great time. And you can see immediately we get responses from bees, ground nesting bees in particular. They love the site being cleared. And so we did a little research project, and you can just see in those petri dishes, I won't get into too much detail, but look at the number of just different bees and insects and everything in that side, and then versus the right side, the right petri dish, which is from one of our unburned, unmanaged areas, and there's just a few things in there. So um, there's a whole score of benefits we can get into for managing the whole ecosystem for, against southern pine beetle or for southern pine beetle resiliency, and there's all these other benefits. So I think one more slide, maybe. Oh, there's a couple more slides still. Yep. Okay, so just suppression, and Kevin really brought this up. A couple things about suppression. One is the rate which it moves, and you have to suppress faster than the spread. So this is one of our early years, and we had this, smallish infestation spot here, and that's the inner circle that's in yellow there, or inner polygon shape. And so we're like, this is a place that we can go suppress. This is doable. While we were out there suppressing, we're like, we're not getting ahead of it. All this, and we look, and all of a sudden now we have that kind of orange color outline there where it had just expanded. We didn't get in front of it. And then at the same time, it had kicked out all these spots, which are those kind of, I illustrate with those orangish ovals and circles there. Kind of, it spit all that out. And so we go, okay, we need to figure out, we got to get to these spots. We need to move out a bit. And then within a few more weeks, it was that whole red area. So we had a crew of, I think, 6 sawyers out there, and over a matter of a month, they could never get to the front of the infestation to actually get to those. They always thought they were cutting like the newly infested trees, but then the further they moved out, they would find, oh no, this tree is infested. It's got a couple in it here. There's one with a couple in there. And every time they thought they were at the front, they just couldn't get to it. So um, that was a really big learning lesson early on. Um, is you have to if you're going to do suppression, you have to have a big enough crew. So if it's just a couple sawyers, I think Kevin mentioned maybe like 100 trees is the best you can do, and that's probably about right. So what we figured, when we had our full crew that had 8 to 10 sawyers, we would do spots up to about 500 trees, and if we could cut all 500 trees in 2 weeks, if we thought we could do that, we would go out and suppress that spot. But anything that we didn't think we could cut all the trees that needed to be cut within a 2-week period, we decided that's too big. And that's just we're gonna have to wait and see what happens there. In New York, what we've experienced a lot is when they get really big, these big infestations, they start kind of, I don't know, they can't, not necessarily folding in on themselves, but SPB doesn't necessarily kill every tree as it moves through. So it can go back and reinfest and clean out, but it gets really dense and it kills a lot of trees along the edges, and then it starts spitting out these little satellites. So what we realized is when it starts, they're almost like spot fires. If you're familiar with fire, you have the fire front, but it can spit, embers and stuff out in front of it. Well, this is kind of the same way. So you have to watch where those spots are kicking out in front of the main area and see if you can attack that area rather than going after, a huge, several hundred acre area like this. And so this was an area that we were concerned about. I just threw this other picture, and you can see, looks like a lot of green pitch pine. Then you see underneath that pitch pine, right above the little motorcycle rider there, is dead. So this is a perfect area where we probably should not have gotten so focused on suppression. You can see that as a super dense forest. We probably could have gone in there and thinned, and it would have been a lot better off, because at a certain point we just had to give up in this area. So they ended up with all these dead trees along the side of the road, which are now a serious hazard, right? So probably if we had gone in and started thinning and working with the county and the town along that road, we could have opened it up and provided a much safer situation for people using that road, and possibly, save more trees in that area by moving away from the suppression and going straight to thinning. Next slide, Jess. And then this is just another example when you get into these really thick spots like this. You can see the dates on this. So at the end of June, basically July, it was these little orange spots that were mapped. And then by October, it was these large red areas. And they actually went into suppress and started suppressing. And then it was like, well, look at how much larger it got. This isn't even realistic. Um, Point being, again, like they were in there on the first, started suppression, and then realized a week later just how big it got. So Kevin mentioned, is it dispersal late in the season? Is it spot expansion? Well, I think we're definitely seeing spot expansion here in New York later in the season. So we always thought, okay, in August is like when we know what's really happening out there and we can get in and start our suppression season. But then the more we got into it, we realized like some things were what they were going to be in August, but then we would get these really large, events happening late September or early October where we'd suddenly see a lot of color change in dead trees. So um, that really stretched it out. And then just to wrap it up, all these things again are summer suppression, which on Long Island we can't do because of the bats. So we have switched to almost 100% um, thinning and the restoration stuff. To get ahead of it, we have 40,000 acres or more of forest that we could thin that doesn't have any southern pine beetle in it. And so that's really the route that we're going to go, because as you can see, you can get in there, but you're going to be chasing your tail unless you have a huge, huge crew and a lot of money. you're going to be chasing your tail with southern pine beetle, and the forest management's the way to go. So that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Jess. That was fantastic. Some of the questions. Actually, does anybody have any questions? Here's one from James. Has there been any studies on forest ecology in SPB impacted areas where there was no active management? How did these forests respond over time? And what was the resulting regeneration / structure?
Well, we don't have any studies going on, but I can say on Long Island, I think what we're seeing is a difference in the Pine Barrens have very sandy soil, and then in some areas they have soil's a little bit better, so there's more oak. So when the soil is slightly better and we have more oaky sites, we have seen some movement towards more of an oak forest than pitch pine. But then we have other spots where that it's moved through and it's a pitch pine site. It'll always be a pitch pine site because it's so sandy. And there is some recruitment in those sites. I think one thing that we really luck out with is it seems like a lot of these Pine Barrens plants have very long-lasting seeds, um, or they're blowing in from somewhere because some of these sites you let the light in, and yeah, maybe the pitch pine regeneration isn't great, but we are seeing a lot of other um, vegetation, shrubby stuff, and I'm not an expert in those plants, but we're seeing a lot of other, I mean, just the little blue stem moving into some of these sites. It's like, okay, great. It's been a closed canopy forest for 40 years, and now all of a sudden we're getting grasses and stuff like that moving in. So I think that's a great idea. We probably could be looking more into that. But I do think it on Long Island definitely seems very site dependent what's happening.
And DC did, Rob, you guys did do some baseline inventories when Southern Pine Beetle had started to show the change in the impact over time. And the Pine Barrens Commission was doing also some baseline studies before management that they continue to advance. So those could be forthcoming as well. Kevin, did Kathleen also, did she compare, she must have compared some baseline stands with no active management in her study with Kathleen?
I mean, Kathleen's probably on here. I don't want to put her on the spot, but yeah, I don't remember what sites she worked at on Long Island. I mean, some of that will tease out from, we have long-term plots in at Rocky Point too. Another student looked at those, some of this information, but really soon after Southern Pine Beetle. So there's nothing there. But I think like what you said or Rob said, there's some of this will be forthcoming. But Kathleen can't unmute herself.
Yeah, Eric, are you able to unmute Kathleen? I tried to, but it didn't.
Yes, let me go ahead and do that.
While Eric does that, I can address the question about cut and leave and the risks associated with slash, and maybe you can say more, Kevin. But Rob, I don't believe we've seen any IPS outbreaks on Long Island because of the slash, correct? Like that's not something that's been obvious to me, at least.
Yeah.
And something I think that we have kind of looked for on some level. Same with the Albany Pine Bush, where they do a lot of active management and might have slash at certain periods of time. Like not existent or much less than expected, perhaps. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I can
But
chime in.
yeah,
I feel like we've done everything we could to create a IPS outbreak in a stand and never had that happen. And that's kind of been consistent outside of pitch pine too. So we'll see IPS, going into the material. We see IPS at high numbers in traps that are monitoring this stuff, but we've yet to see IPs move into healthy living trees?
We have seen increased IPS activity and turpentine activity, but not very limited mortality. So 1 or 2 trees in a particular area. So Kathleen, are you unmuted?
Yes, I'm unmuted. I would say, to speak to James's question, the control sites that I looked at didn't have southern pine beetle activity in them. So it was just looking at sort of unmanaged conditions. But we did also do some sampling at Wertheim and some other sites coming in post southern pine beetle. And I mean, we were really seeing a pretty full mortality in terms of overstory pitch pine. So a lot of like loss of seed source. And then sort of anecdotally, I'd say a transition to fully huckleberry and greenbrier understories. And so really kind of a change into a different sort of novel forest condition. And I think Jake spoke to it earlier, but just that need for really disturbed soils to come through. And so because those transitions are happening without anything happening to the forest understory, we're not seeing, sort of that sandy soil being exposed. And so we're not having the right conditions for pitch pine to come back most of the time just from southern pine beetle mortality.
Thank you, Kathleen, for being willing to be put on the spot and sharing your expertise and knowledge. So we are running a little bit behind. Kevin, do you want to take the 15-minute break and we can move into a 15 minutes after or for questions, or do you want to just move on to the next presentation?
No, I mean, we should do a break. And Felicia and Mark, if I'm wrong on this, when we met with our pre-meeting, you thought maybe you wouldn't need the whole 25 too. So we might catch up a little bit. So
Right.
why don't we do a 10-minute break instead of 15 if Felicia and Mark are cool with that?
Totally fine.
Okay. All right. So let's do 10 then, Polly.
Okay. So 10-minute break. I'll be back here at 11 o'clock.
Cool. Thanks, Molly.
So welcome back. I hope everyone had a quick break and is slightly refreshed, but we're moving forward. I find all of this very exciting and compelling. And I'm looking forward to your talk, Felicia. So Felicia, I'm going to mess up your last name. Eubanks?
You back?
Is that right?
Like I got you back? You back?
Is a forest health specialist out of Massachusetts with the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And so she's going to share what we're seeing as far as patterns and impact and outbreaks in the state. So take it away.
All right. Can you guys see my screen all right?
Yes, perfect.
Looks good.
All right. Like the rest of them, I can't find my arrows. There we go. I think I got it. There we go. All right. So as Jess said, in 2014, there was that big southern pine beetle outbreak on Long Island, and I was one of the lucky ones who got to go down there and help them work on it. And after doing that, me and the supervisor at the time, Ken Gooch, decided that it would be best if we started trapping to see when this line of southern pine beetle hit us, because we knew it was just a matter of time. So we started planning for 2015. We used the Lindgren funnel traps with wet collection, and we used the Frontalin lure, Alpha Pini lure, and the Endo brevicomen lure. I'm not sure if I said that right, but for the first 5 years of trapping, the Alpha Pini lure was placed on a separate stick, 15 feet away from that trap and about 5 feet off the ground. However, since then, we started putting them all on the trap, and it hasn't seemed to have made a difference one way or the other. So unfortunately, this is not going to be as exciting as the past presentations. I'm just giving you the facts of what happened previously. So 2015, we put out 29 traps. 13 of those are positive. So when I'm making the maps, I think of red as the positive, it's bad, and the green is good, just to help you guys out. We put all of the traps, the majority of them were down in the Cape and on Martha's Vineyard. However, we had a couple of inland pitch pine bearings, so we trapped in those too, just to see what would pop up. We maybe caught 32 insects for the entire year, and all of that was out of traps. There were no infested trees. So, 2016, once again, about 24 traps, only 5 positive this time. All of our traps were out on the Cape, and very, very, very low trap catches. The highest per cycle, when I say per cycle, we check the trap catches every 2 weeks, so that would be one cycle. And the highest trap catch all cycles, that is for the trapping season. So we only had 7 that year, no infested trees. I also put stars on the points that had the highest trap catches. 2017, once again, very, very, very low count. Only 1 beetle caught, regardless of the fact that we put out 30 traps, which we were happy with. We weren't complaining at this point. 2018, we put out 21 traps. We got 4 positives. We'd get 1 beetle per trap cycle, and the highest catch was 1. And so we had 4 southern pine beetles in 1 year in 2018, and you can see where those were caught. 2019, 19 traps. Only 1 was positive on Martha's Vineyard. And so we only got 2 beetles that year. Still no infested trees. Now, 2020 and 2021, we did not trap. 2020, we didn't trap due to COVID. And 2021, we didn't trap because during the spring trapping season, our boss, Nicole Kelleher, was giving birth. So that just threw a monkey wrench into things since we are such a small forest health group. But we did go out to each point that we had found previous southern pine beetle in traps, and we just did ground surveys. And I like this photo. This isn't us doing ground surveys. This is the guys taking the trees down. But I just want to show you how thick it is out in Martha's Vineyard with that brush. You're talking blueberry, greenbrier, scrub oak. And for some reason on Martha's Vineyard, there's a lot of viburnum. But there was no ability to see much in front of you when you were working, and sometimes you completely disappeared in that scrub. So it did make it a little difficult to get to the trees to survey them, but that's what we did that year, those 2 years. Now in 2022, this is where things really start getting interesting. We put out 24 traps. 19 of those traps were positive. I created these layers so that the larger the number collected in the trap, the larger the circle. So you can really see where the higher numbers were caught. The highest trap catch per 2 weeks was 83 beetles, which had been the most that we had ever seen up to this point. The highest trap catch for that spring season was 136, and total for the year was 277. And this marks the first time we had infested trees. Those infested trees were on the mainland, and they were at the center of this really big point right to the right of Falmouth. That was actually in Mashpee. So those infested trees, we had a trap in. Yep, we brought it in. I'm not proud of that. But there were multiple pitch tubes, fewer than 10. And in order to properly identify that these were southern pine beetles and not ips, we took a draw knife and hacked it up, found a sample right in that goop, cleaned it up, put it under the microscope, and sure enough, it was a confirmed southern pine beetle. So we knew from there going forward, it was going to be pretty exciting. So in the spring, we did 24 traps. You'll notice that I have spring and fall trapping on this one. It was around this point that I talked to a graduate named Carolyn, who recommended that we start trapping in the fall, seeing what we got in the spring. And she always got higher numbers trapping in the fall, where we were only trapping in the spring. So because of our high numbers the previous year and our high trap in spring, we did the fall trapping as well. And it was beneficial because we did end up catching a lot more beetles, and we could really see where they were moving to. So the total for that year was over 1,000 insects collected. However, we also had 300 plus infested trees. There comes a point where counting just gets difficult. And at this time, we were also picking up southern pine beetle from the air. So this is our aerial survey. And I want you to notice that we got this point right here in Nantucket, these 2 points up here at the top of Martha's Vineyard, and then this point right here. Because in Nantucket in August, we got notification from the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. And what they told us is they're like, we think we have southern pine beetle. It's in our long-eared bat hibernacle area, which was really disappointing, but we went out to check it out. And while we were out there, we got as many people from the area to come, professionals, so that they can see how we're diagnosing this. So here you can see Nicole popping off some bark and showing the southern pine beetles on the tip of the axe. Here, I mean, just even walking up to the stand, like all of this is just us walking up. You can see the trees right here and through here and all around here. A lot of them were already dead when we showed up, and some still had some brown needles on them. But within a week of us like sort of discovering that site, we received phone calls from Sheriff's Meadow, and that was those 2 dots on the northern part of Martha's Vineyard. And while we were out there, we took a look at our own park, Manuel Coriolis, and saw several pockets in there. So it was the first time that we had a serious outbreak. Just to show you, this is a wonderful video of a beetle crawling through or swimming through that pitch. But here is where the outbreak was for the Nantucket Foundation, Conservation Foundation. Here's Sheriff's Meadow, and this is our spot right here. Okay, just making sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yeah. So the Sheriff's Meadow, they had a few trees themselves. They took care of that. Nantucket Conservation took care of that. We can only do work on our property. So these photos are from Manuel Coriolis State Park. And when we went in, originally it wasn't too bad. Like it was maybe, I want to say 70 to 80 trees. However, by the time that we got folks on the ground, which had to wait for those bats to leave those trees, it was late September, early October, and it was much too late to do a suppression cut, but that's exactly what we did anyway. All that slash was taken and burned in a burn box. The trunks were left with that chainsaw mark right up the bark. And at the end of the day, because as these guys were cutting, we were doing buffer surveys around the edges. We were still finding some. So at the end of the day, we ended up taking out 111 infested trees, and 167 buffer trees were cut. We did additional surveys around those areas, and at that time, everything looked good. So then we enter 2024. And here you can see we've got the 2 traps again. And you'll notice that the points are very large at this point in time. Like this is the biggest circle. because there were hundreds of beetles in these traps. Spring went by, highest trap count was 375. The spring total was almost 3,000 insects. Obviously, the majority all coming from the Cape. Then we trapped in the fall, and the very first trap collection that was collected from all these traps was extremely high. I ended up getting one trap that had almost 1,000 insects in it. That was from this Mashpee area right here. Seeing that, we immediately took down all the traps because the last thing that we wanted to do at this point was call more beetles into these locations. So we knocked down all the traps. Additional ground surveys were completed. We did find a couple of trees, not that big of a deal, but however, on the vineyard, it was a completely different animal. So from aerial survey, you can see that some of these points, these 2 points up here have grown. We ended up with another point up there, but they just kind of like peppered throughout the western edge of Martha's Vineyard. Let me see here, make sure I'm not missing anything. So in April, be sure it's April. Yeah, sorry guys, everything just gets confusing sometimes. But in April 2004, we went out because we heard from the park supervisor, Manuel Coriolis, that he was seeing more infested trees. So in April, we did a delineation survey, found 50 trees. We took those down, all of those, plus 60 buffer trees. However, the infestation continued to spread within the stand, despite us going there rapidly and taking care of this. Additional ground surveys in July identified approximately 20 more infested trees, and follow-up surveys in September expanded to over 400 infested trees. So it was pretty crazy. These guys got a good workout. And I will say, because this was on an island, we learned a lot about what you can and cannot bring onto a ferry. For instance, all the chainsaws, all the equipment had to be empty of gas, which we did not show up with empty items. So you can get a feeling for what I'm talking about there. 2005, we did absolutely no southern pine beetle trapping. The only reason we had bark beetle traps up, or southern pine beetle traps up, was because we were doing early detection and rapid response pathogen traps. So we chose locations that had a lot of commerce and trade, lots of railroads, close to highways, that sort of thing. We only found 2 southern pine beetles, which was great, and I'm still waiting for the results on the pathogens. But when you look at our aerial survey, you'll see that now Nantucket's got several pockets, but Martha's Vineyard is lit up, particularly the western side of that polygon. And over the winter, going into 2025, we kept hearing from the park supervisors out on Washburn Island. Washburn Island is really small, and it's literally just off of the mainland right here. And it's not like you can get a ferry or a large boat to this island. There's like no big dock or anything like that. So it's mostly a campground for folks that can, get over on a little boat. And that's been interesting because we have no way to get equipment over there. So the best that we can tell them is to drop the trees and leave them. And I believe at that point in time, that was about 20 trees. July or August of 2025, I got a report. Well, I get lots of reports of southern pine beetle from the Cape, and went out to check this one out. It was in Osterville, which is Barnstable, very close to the water. And this is the tree that the report came from. It's a white pine on the edge of a pond, very old tree, multi-branched, multi-stemmed. what was weird was that this tree had all kinds of southern pine beetle tubes. I was able to find a southern pine beetle, look at it under magnification, confirm that that's what it was. And because the tree was coming down the very next day, I was allowed to use my draw knife and go at it. And I found that the galleries for these would only go an inch or two tops and then just kind of peter out. But these trees were really, I mean, this tree was really loaded with southern pine beetle pitch tubes. And the funny thing is if you turned your back away from this tree, you could kind of see it over in this edge picture. Like there were a ton of pitch pines on this property, but the only thing that had southern pine beetle was this one really old white pine. We even took a ride around the area, the neighborhood, and tried to find anything else because we figured this was coming from a spot locally. And try as I might, we were not able to find it. Then in September, me and Mark were able to get out onto Martha's Vineyard to see what exactly was going on the ground that was mapped from the air. These images that you're seeing were from around the previous year's cut on Manuel Coriolis. And every single pitch pine around that cut, for as far as my eye could see, was browned out and loaded with southern pine beetle. As a matter of fact, when we were going out and looking at the different polygons from aerial survey, the island looked like it was in rough shape for trees. All the beech had beech leaf disease, and then all the pitch pine had southern pine beetle. And as we were tooling around, we came upon this, which was quite interesting. It was like a little road going to a driveway. And on one side of it, they had a row of white pine in back of a row of Norway spruce. So that's what we're looking at here is white pine and Norway spruce. And they were loaded with pitch tubes, which was surprising. But then when you looked around and realized everything else is infested, it wasn't as much, it wasn't too surprising at that point. I did not draw knife these because I did not have my truck with my tools in it. But there were quite a few pitch pine, pitch tubes on these trees. And here you could see a couple more, and you know, it just wiped these trees out. Not that they were in great shape to begin with. So to kind of wrap this all up, every time a southern pine beetle was found, whether it was in a trap or in a tree, I tried to keep track of that so we know when southern pine beetle was first found in that town. So that's what you're seeing here. And then to really kind of, you know, messy up this map, I added all the trap finds. So those are the triangles, and the tree infested tree finds, and those are the points. And I want to point out to you guys that just because you're seeing like one point, that does not mean that there's one tree. Each point represented on here, except for one or two, is a group of trees, anywhere from 5, and I think the largest we had was down on the island. I believe that was about 100. So this has really come a long way since we first started in 2015, and just over the winter getting all of these reports in. And I know I got a report that Chatham was it was found in Chatham on a nonprofit. However, I don't have a point for that because I wasn't given a Latin law. But I know that there's more out there than what we are seeing right here on this map. It's just a matter of finding it. So if there's any questions, I know that was not as exciting as what the other folks have presented, but it's how it is.
Thank you, Felicia. We're going to hold questions until the end so that we don't get further behind. So appreciate, oh, wow, I've really gone trippy there. I really appreciate your time and expertise in sharing the distribution of southern pine beetle and what you're seeing on the ground. We really tried hard in Long Island to contain it, and so I do feel remorse and it's very frustrating that we've shared it with you all, and I apologize. So, but here to help as we can. So
yes, we're doing what we can.
Yes, and I appreciate your humor at the end with the beetles.
You gotta have a little laugh.
Yes, can't lose our sense of humor. So, Jake, we'll turn it over to you. So Jake McCumber has been one of the active and very engaged members of NAFSE, and he has been very invaluable of helping me get up to speed on Pine Barrens management when I first started. He's going to talk about pitch pine restoration and the work that he's been doing at Camp Edwards with the Army National Guard. So go for it, Jake.
Thank you, Polly, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with you. Thanks to all the other speakers. We've gotten a lot of great information today, and I really appreciate how many people have shown up for this webinar today. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about has already been touched on in some of the other presentations, but this is a familiar role for me where I'm really kind of a cheerleader for the active Pine Barrens stewardship and restoration work. And it's particularly relevant today, as we heard from Kevin and Rob and others, that all of our objectives when we're managing for ecosystem health in the Pine Barrens are nicely aligned. And so that's really beneficial. And so then it comes down to being able to obtain and mobilize the resources to do that work. But whether we're managing to reduce fire hazard and protect our communities, we're managing just to restore biodiversity and ecosystem function, or we're managing to protect our forests against southern pine beetle, to increase recreational opportunities, all those things really look the same from a stewardship perspective. And so that's my overview today. Oh, and my slides aren't moving forward. There we go. So looking at our pitch pine communities in Massachusetts, usually what we're talking about are the remnant pine barrens. And Caroline showed some good maps from the Nature Conservancy of those remnant pine barrens, but you can see a lot of what we're talking about just from those iNaturalist observations in the bottom right. You got that really high density of pitch pine observations on from Plymouth and Carver down through the Cape and onto the islands. And that's one of the most prominent remnants of the North Atlantic coastal pine barrens ecoregion, along with Long Island, which we heard about earlier, and southern New Jersey. And this used to be a broad expanse of a coastal ecosystem that now just has these three remnant areas. But there's also those inland pine barrens like at Montague Plains and Muddy Brook and some other sites scattered around Massachusetts that are managed by Mass Wildlife, Mass DCR, the trustees, and others. And then, of course, when you get outside Massachusetts, there's Albany Pine Bush and Concord Pine Barrens and some other good examples of those inland barrens. But then beyond that, again, as you can see from those observations, there's pitch pine as a prominent part of the natural community scattered throughout large portions of Massachusetts that are still important to consider from a stewardship perspective, and especially when we're talking about protecting that element of our natural communities from southern pine beetle. And so most of the area covered by those pitch pine communities has been negatively impacted over time. And Caroline mentioned that earlier too. And we've lost the vast majority of that North Atlantic coastal pine barrens ecoregion. As it shows here, Connecticut estimates they've lost 95% of that ecosystem, which would have been the dominant ecosystem historically in Connecticut, at least along the coastal region. And most of that's because of development. Massachusetts has the fifth highest population density in Massachusetts, and that's common through a lot of these northeastern states. And so we've just developed away most of the pitch pine natural communities. But beyond that, what's left is really suffering from a lack of fire over the decades. Fire is the key natural process maintaining the ecological interactions within the pine barrens. And the lack of fire leads to degraded biodiversity and ultimately succession and conversion of those pitch pine communities to red maple, white pine, more mesic conditions. And that's because all those different effects that the fire has in the community and the loss of that leads to many types of disturbance. But we're also suffering from long-term land use history effects. This whole region was cleared of trees for a very long time, really hundreds of years post-colonization. And then really it wasn't until the 1940s through the 1960s that a lot of that land use started to change. And the areas that were left over as natural areas all started growing up at the same time. So we have an extremely dense condition, very high tree density, closed canopy conditions, shading out the understory, development of really deep organic matter that's modifying the soil condition. It excludes uh, seed germination because seeds can't reach the bare sand. So endemic plants like Hudsonia and Pityopsis start disappearing. Pitch pine has no regeneration, and then it's a more vulnerable condition to pests like spongy moth, southern pine beetle, obviously, and so many others because we have stress trees and low health, low vigor, those high densities. So those of us with stewardship responsibility then need to address all those different threats and impacts on our pine barrens. And so from specific objectives, we're talking about reducing tree density, like we've been hearing about today, exposing the sandy soil intentionally to allow for that seed germination, increasing the structural diversity and age diversity within the stands. And then broadly, our objective is really to restore the rich biodiversity of a healthy pine barrens and to maximize landscape patch complexity with different scales of treatment, different types and seasonality of treatment, but ensuring connectivity between these managed patches. And so again, that's focusing on a lot of those biodiversity goals, but really meeting those southern pine beetle resilience needs while we're doing it. So when we're talking about restoring pitch pine natural communities and pine barrens through stewardship, what we're talking about is restoring the natural disturbance regimes, restoring fire as the key ecological process within the pine barrens. And as we do that, we restore all those ecological interactions that are broken through mesification, through development of that organic matter and lack of fire. But using forestry and other tools like that to facilitate the restoration of fire into the landscape to maintain the ecosystem health. And so when we're talking about restoration through forestry, some of that's whole tree timber harvesting, like shown in these photos. Some of it's understory mowing. Rob was talking about both of those tools and how they've used those on Long Island. And they're absolutely essential to manage different conditions that we have in these forests based on the land use history. This image here, again, is showing a whole tree timber harvest on Camp Edwards. And I tried to get the numbers throughout Massachusetts, but I didn't get it in time. But on Camp Edwards, we're doing about 60 acres per year of mechanical forestry on the training site. Then we're also doing about 400 acres per year of prescribed burning. And those tools really go hand in hand to truly restore the ecosystem function in these areas. Forestry is, the more controversial tool. And I think a lot of that is because the lay public and environmental activists think of forestry as just a black and white thing. And they're picturing like a hillside clear cut in Oregon or something of that nature, which is not at all representative of what we're doing with this conservation forestry. We're using this as a tool for ecosystem health. So there's a lot of science into it, there's a lot of care into it, and there's incredible results. That photo on the right is just a year and a half after the harvest that's ongoing in the photo on the left. And so forestry is so essential because it provides planning and specificity. We're able to actually develop a prescription based on the site condition, the current vegetative community, the topography, the management objectives, whether we're prioritizing fire hazard reduction, biodiversity objectives, any of those other things, and we can build that all into the prescription intentionally. So we can determine what we want our size classes to be within the post-treatment condition, what we want our age structure to be, the varying density throughout the site. And so we can specifically plan for that structural diversity that's the core foundation for the biodiversity that then will develop. With fire, we don't get that specificity. It might be that key ecological process, but when we're restoring from that degraded land use condition history, um, we need the specificity of the forestry. Forestry provides a lot of other intentional benefits too, where we're actively removing the biomass. The pine barrens and other pitch pine natural communities evolved on low nutrient soils. And so part of that stewardship is actually removing biomass from the site so that it doesn't continue to develop deeper and deeper organic mats that block the sand, that block that seed germination, and block the nesting of ground nesting bees and tiger beetles and so much else. So we can directly do that with the forestry. I'm a big advocate of skid roads. Skid roads often get a bad rap, but they're one of the best ways to actually expose corridors of sand and allow colonization of the restored sites by species like frosted elfin butterflies and rare plants and so much else. And then forestry allows us to really specifically address uh, problematic fuel conditions or vegetative conditions for introducing fire to a site. So where so many of us are working up against neighborhoods or have downwind sensitive smoke receptors and things like that, using mechanical forestry, we can mitigate the concerns with the vegetation, whether we're just doing the understory mowing or we're cutting and removing it from the site and greatly open up the number of burn windows that we have, the number of potential burn days and weather conditions that we can use on that site to burn it safely. And then again, fire is the fundamental ecological process. It's affecting the soils, it's affecting the ground layer vegetation and organic matter. It's affecting the mid-story and the overstory canopy. It's touching everything out there and driving those ecological relationships between the plants and animals in the soil. And you can see that just in that photo on the right, which is just 1 year after a single prescribed burn in that stand. And you can see the invigorated blueberry and huckleberry understory. You can see the much more open mid-story. You don't have a lot of clutter in that zone. And so that's what really allows for uh, rejuvenating insect biodiversity, which then supports insectivorous birds like the whippoorwill and so much else. This is how you restore all of these populations and that biodiversity by returning fire to the pine barrens. And you can see the amount of sunlight that's able to reach the understory just with that one burn. And so fire, like I said, it's doing so much in there. Growing season fire in particular helps expose those sandy soils to allow for the germination of all the plants and again to support so much of the wildlife that depends on some of the bare sand in there. It's making the leaves of vegetation more available to insects and other species that need to eat it. It drives better mast years, acorn crops, and the scrub oak, and so much else. And the plants and animals are so incredibly well adapted to it, and you just get this remarkable response. You know, within the first year, the scrub oak is already knee high, and by the next year, it's up to your waist. So these plants, they depend on the fire as much as they're resilient to it. And again, fire can be really hard to implement. It's challenging to maintain a fire program. It's challenging to implement the burns, but we have good partnerships working together, groups like NAFSE that keep us all working together. But that's where forestry is such an essential tool. We can make the maintenance of the program and implementation of the fires so much more achievable when we're pairing forestry up with that. And this is just a little bit of what it looks when you bring that all together. This was a 52-acre timber harvest that we did on Camp Edwards. We had an area that was dominated by coppiced oak trees that really shaded out the understory. Uh, Before treatment, we would detect like 2 whippoorwills around that site when we would do our surveys. Biodiversity was really fairly suppressed because it was so shaded. So we went in intentionally with that 52-acre harvest, had a highly varied prescription on the site. Some areas we took more trees, and other areas we left more trees, again to provide that variability. Followed it up with prescribed fire, treated the tree oak coppicing in there. So we usually go in there and cut it and then paint the majority of the resprouting stems to select for more pitch pine scrub oak dominated habitat. And Within just a few years, we had an incredible flight of buck moths throughout that site. We had frosted elfin butterflies colonize the area. Red crossbills spent an entire year in this site because of how great of a pitch pine cone crop we had. Those pines that had withstood the 1988 wildfire had been so suppressed by all of the competition with those oak trees. But once they were released, they started growing faster. They started putting more oaks, more cones on and everything. We saw rare plants move in through the skid roads. And so again, it's just restoring all of those ecological interactions and driving the ecosystem health. And so a healthy pine barrens or pitch pine community is a patchwork across the landscape. And so much of it depends on that structural diversity that I've mentioned. And but where you create that and where you provide connectivity between these managed patches, the biodiversity responds with incredible vigor. But at the same time, when we're thinking about southern pine beetle, we're not going to be able to manage the entire landscape. But if we can focus on an effective patchwork of management that's supporting the biodiversity, at the same time, we're basically creating this net that's going to help us stop southern pine beetle outbreaks as they move like a wildfire across the landscape. And so with good planning and good layout of these treatments throughout Massachusetts, we can provide protection against southern pine beetle on the landscape at large. And again, this is just a little bit of what that looks like. Some of these treatments are leaving, you know, not a closed canopy forest, but forest dominated sites, while others are opening it up to shrubland and grassland and driving that biodiversity. And we see that site after site as we're doing this work. And by we, I mean all the agencies and NGOs who are working together on this. And one good example I got from Mass Wildlife is that at Muddy Brook, they've been doing a lot of bee work that actually goes back to before they started restoration at that wildlife management area. And before they did a timber harvest, they found 36 species of bees at Muddy Brook. Just after the one treatment of timber harvest, they had 103 species of bee that they found. And Rob mentioned similar things. As soon as you open that up, you've got ground nesting bees starting to come back in there and things like that. And then after follow-on treatments with fire and other restoration work, now they're up to 177 species of bee at just Muddy Brook Wildlife Management Area. That's an incredible biodiversity response. And we see that throughout all these managed areas in Massachusetts, whether it's Miles Standish State Forest or Camp Edwards on the Cape, uh, the Manny Corellis State Forest down on the Vineyard, all these sites together, we're seeing similar results. The eastern whippoorwills declined by 70% of its population since 1970. So such incredible loss. But at Camp Edwards, in our long-term monitoring, the eastern whippoorwill is increasing at 6.8% per year. So a remarkable population trend that's directly in response to the forestry and prescribed burning that the moth populations that they depend on. So we see similar results within our moth monitoring, and that's directly driving whippoorwill increases on the landscape. At the same time, forest-dependent species like the scarlet tanager are increasing just as strongly. And that's again because we're restoring that whole ecosystem function and all of those different species within it. And so scarlet tanager is another insectivore. So they respond positively to both forestry and fire in these pine barrens that have been degraded through that land use history over the last few hundred years. So they're increasing just as strongly at Camp Edwards. And we see that through rare plants, beetles, butterflies, and so much more. But then importantly, we also see that when it comes to climate change, because we're increasing resilience on these sites. So forestry and fire leads to really high carbon sequestration rates because we're rejuvenating that young, fast-growing condition in the vegetation. But also we're leading to long-term resilience for those overstory trees. We're reducing their competition. We're increasing their canopy, bulk, their canopy ratio, and making it so that we're avoiding catastrophic conditions like wildfire or southern pine beetle outbreaks. There's a lot of challenges to doing this work, and one of those is the public opinion and environmental activism that's focused on climate change, but misguided or misinformed on ecology. And so we need to continue to provide ecological information to the public, to environmental activists, and to politicians, because a lot of that's led to things like forestry moratoriums and forestry reserves that specifically bars this type of restoration work, both forestry and fire. But beyond that, the cost of restoration, it's not just Long Island that's suffering from that. When we started doing this, it was about $2,000 an acre for a lot of this forestry. Now that's over $4,500. And that was last year. Diesel prices now, that's probably significantly higher. And that's another issue with this, is we're burning diesel to ship the chips all the way up to Vermont and New Hampshire to burn as biomass for power generation. And we need local markets so that we reduce the cost of this, so that we're burning less carbon to do it, and so that those products can be used locally. People still don't want the lumber, but we could use chips for biochar or food waste composting or other things. So if somebody really wanted to make a difference here, they'd figure out a local market for wood chips in southeastern Massachusetts. But then, just to summarize again real quick, the key message of all of this, one is that proactive restoration of our pine barrens is the best way to deal with southern pine beetle. And you've heard that in multiple talks before me. The suppression cuts aren't going to get on top of southern pine beetles. We need to continue to broaden and expand proactive restoration of our pine barrens to get ahead of southern pine beetles. But the good news of that is that that's what we need to do in the pine barrens anyway, to protect our communities from wildfire, to restore biodiversity, to restore the ecosystem health and the climate resilience of our pine barrens. And we can do all of that with these same projects. So it's really efficient and it's so highly beneficial. So that's what I have today. And I hope that this drives more of that proactive work. So thank you.
Jake, that was phenomenal. Thank you for tying all that together related to the southern pine beetle, how it's getting its foot in the door, or it's, I don't know, proboscis, chewing through those trees rapidly, and why, for us on Long Island, and I'm sure for yourself, southern pine beetle has been the silver lining to help really bring to attention to the public and to the decision makers of all that we had been advocating for related to the forest management. So I don't know why I'm blurry, but thank you for that, Jake. That was fantastic. So turning it over to Mark Falkenberry. He's with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. I keep trying to give you an alternative association, but to talk about your southern pine beetle management plan within the state of Massachusetts. And this plan is loaded onto the NAFSE resource page that has been shared. So I'm going to turn off my terrible video and audio and give it over to you, Mark.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to keep us on time. Have no fear. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm going to present the Massachusetts Southern Pine Beetle Response Plans for you. I'm Mark Falkenberry, Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. Before I jump in, I wanted to show you an actual image of a southern pine beetle outbreak. This is in Nottingham County Park in Pennsylvania. We got notice. I was in the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry for 12 years, and we got a report that there were some bark beetles in this county park. So we came and we brought a drone and our drone pilot, and he got it up in the air and got some really good images of southern pine beetle infestation there. And it was a great project. The minute they saw that and they saw the extent of it, they moved into action and they took care of it. So a very positive outcome. So Southern Pine Beetle Response Plan was released in June of 2018. We just updated it in February of 2026. We have multiple contributors that have all played a part. Many of you have heard from them today. So that's what the cover looks like. If you see it, you'll know you're looking at the right one. So we have a multiple component approach to this. There's 6 parts. public outreach, assessing pitch pine conditions, detection and monitoring, forest management and ecosystem restoration, targeted spot suppression and disruption, and post-outbreak restoration and monitoring. So for public outreach, for the first one, we're increasing support for forest management and restoration of pitch pine ecosystems. Outline the management objectives and explain the treatment goals, methods, outcomes, and assessments. Our target audience are elected officials, the public, landowners, NGOs, landscape professionals, regulatory agencies, and so forth. For assessing pitch pine conditions, number 2, it's extensive surveying and mapping pitch pine forest across the landscape. This allows you to prioritize your areas for treatment, and to go along with that, you can identify the highest hazard stands right away and give those the attention first. So stand level maps of baseline forest inventory can do this, and you can also in a pinch use quick forest surveys just estimating basal area. For detection and monitoring, we want to assess the southern pine beetle presence, extent, severity across the entire landscape. This is an ongoing need. It always needs to be done routinely. So some of the tools that we have are aerial surveys, ground surveys, and insect trapping. Traditionally, aerial surveys have been done by fixed-wing aircraft. I have recently submitted a proposal for an aerial survey of the state forest that you've heard about in Martha's Vineyard from a drone. We are prohibited from using drones on state forest land. We are allowed to use Mass DOT. They have a outfit of drone pilots, and we have to pay them, and we can get approval for them to fly this for us. I have written the proposal. I've had one meeting about it already, and I'm confident that this will eventually get done. To get on my soapbox, drones are the safest and cheapest way to survey southern pine beetle infestations, and they are an established forest health tool for state governments across the country. It keeps people out of planes. So for active forest management and restoration, you've heard this a lot already, and I'm going to say it again. Preventative stand thinning makes it harder for southern pine beetle to get established and spread across the landscape. Think of this as the gold standard. You aren't chasing these suppression cuts around. You've also heard this too. It is a native insect. It's doing what it's supposed to do. If anything, we made it worse and not it. So infestations are still going to happen, but it'll be a reduced rate and reduced severity. So pure pitch pine and pitch pine oak forest should be thinned to a residual basal area at or less than 60 square foot per acre, and 80 foot is the max. I know you heard that from Kevin's talk already too. So, but stands with basal area at or above 120 square foot per acre are the highest risk. That's hair on fire stuff. So you need to get to that fast or first. So to continue on the active forest management and restoration tools, for stand thinning, you target the pitch pine stands first with basal areas over 100 square foot per acre. Your goal is 60 or less. You're also in that process, you're removing the dominant or co-dominant hardwoods from that stand. Whole tree mastication, that's basically just grinding and shredding and chopping up the tree material. You can use a tractor, you can use an excavator. This can be done in concert with stand thinning, and the material is usually burned on site. So chipping or burning does reduce the amount of material on the site and potential habitat for other bark beetles. I know the jury's still out on if it increases it or not, but this will take care of that once and for all. Air curtain burners are an efficient way to reduce fuels after stand disturbance. I am not an air curtain burner expert. I did find an image on one from a manufacturer online, and I put it there so you could see it. It actually looks like a pretty fun day in the field running that thing. But to go into fire, though, the near-term fire hazard can increase, and it needs to be considered. A prescribed fire plan could help reduce the amounts of down materials over time. So for number 5, suppression and disruption of infestations. You've already heard these. We have cut and remove, cut and leave, and also do nothing. Unless you're doing it for public safety, which we completely understand and support, there's no need to cut already killed trees in the forest from southern pine beetle. You should do these cuts in the summer to stop the expanding infestations. It's not recommended for winter cutting. For the green tree buffer that you cut around, the size varies with the infestation, but you're looking at a minimum of 60 feet. So a lot of our knowledge, as you've heard, a lot of our knowledge and experience with southern pine beetle have come from the southern states. In the southern states, these infestations can behave a little differently where there's an actual infestation front that's moving in a specific direction, and you can cut that green tree buffer around that infestation front. In the Northeast, they can behave a little differently, and there might not be a front. It may just kind of be a blob where it's just emanating out from all directions. So that means more trees being cut for your buffer because you have to cut it over a larger area. So good thing about going last is all your stuff gets covered. So I'm not going to jump into this because I know Kevin covered it, but I do want to mention that this is in the response plan. And there's a lot more detail in there about these methods, but I just wanted to bring that up. So number 6, for post-outbreak restoration and monitoring, your suppression cuts should be revisited every 2 to 4 weeks, and you survey for any trees you missed or any trees that are infested. If you see one, you have to immediately remove it, and then you go back in 2 to 4 weeks again. So there are a few caveats to this plan. They will be managed, or they can be managed differently in urban areas. So that's the public safety issue I was saying. Whereas you might leave a dead tree in the forested settings, unless it's a hiking path or something like that, that's a public safety. In urban areas, you'll have to remove that tree. It can be a public safety issue. The infested trees should be removed quickly. Uninfested trees you can protect with some insecticides in Massachusetts. Your likelihood of getting attacked is your proximity to an already infested area. That's not always true, but if you're just playing the odds and you're going to protect some trees, those would be the ones you would hit first. We've had trees that get infested in urban areas that are nowhere near an infestation. So that's not always true, but if you're just playing the odds, those are the greatest chance of trees to be infested. As with any insecticide, could be anything. Insecticide treatment should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So fire hazard. So southern pine beetle infestations will increase the amount of standing dead wood on a site. And if you do suppression cuts, you're adding coarse woody debris to the site. This may increase the risk of fire, but we need to learn more about how it behaves in the Northeast to see if that is indeed true, but it will be adding dead wood to the site. So measures such as wood removal, mastication and chipping, or clearing a fuel-free buffer zone around suppression areas should be considered. So in summary, I could have done this in 2 slides, I guess, but in summary, there's a 6-component plan, 6 components to this plan: public outreach, assessing pitch pine conditions, detection and monitoring, forest management, ecosystem restoration, targeted spot suppression and disruption, post-outbreak restoration and monitoring, and you also need to consider urban areas and fire risk when you're involved in these. The urban areas need to be managed differently. So I can talk about Eastern walking stick for quite a long time. I don't have enough time to do it today, but I wanted to close with something. The other Forest Hills folks on here will all understand how uncommon this is. This is a ridge that was defoliated by Eastern walking stick. We had a spot in Pennsylvania in one of our state forests that reliably would have a massive outbreak around every 7-ish years. And I was fortunate enough to where my tenure there overlapped with one of the infestations. And it is really impressive to see. I took botanists out there, other people, and they all would just giggle like little kids at seeing so many walking sticks in one place. It's really neat. They're not a pest, they're not a problem, but I just wanted to show you something different to close us out with. And I really thank you for your time. I thank everybody. Presentations were great today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you so much.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, Mark, for that
Thank you.
overview.
Thank you. I hope I didn't race through it. I was trying to keep us on time.
Nope, you're great. 2 minutes early.
Okay.
Gold star for you. Let me go back here to, okay. Let's make sure that I'm at the top here. Okay. So Claire Rutledge from Connecticut, she had asked, how do satellite photos play into the survey work for SPB? Are you talking near map, Claire, or?
I mean, we tried using satellite photos in 2020. Sorry, my picture's not coming up, but we tried using satellite photos in 2020 when we weren't able to fly. And for our state, it was just really difficult because it maps the change in canopy. So most of the time when we go to a spot, we would see a change in land use, not a change in canopy. So we kind of have shied away from using the satellites for detecting things like that. But if you've got recommendations, we're willing to work with it.
I mean, Polly, you mentioned near map, and I know Kathy had success with that on Brookhaven. So it may be a
Right.
thing where if you kind of have a good idea of your property or land holdings and all of that, like, monitoring it through something like near map could be really useful.
Yeah, we found it to be very effective if you can afford it. And it's, I think you look at the cost benefit analysis between flying regularly for the forest health inventories. The near map has a spring, fall, or spring, summer, and fall, I believe, imagery, spring/winter. So they have that imagery with the leaves on and the leaves off. And because it's so periodic through the summer, you're able to get what it looks like as the trees start to fade from the infestations in the fall to what's happening as you move forward through the season. Not everybody has been able to afford that, unfortunately. And within near map, you're not supposed to be sharing outside of your area, but near map is an option. But
there
and
is
then
also
yeah.
Oh, sorry, Polly.
Oh no, I was going to share is Mark, you highlighted the use of the drones. So if you are looking to see what is happening, you can put a drone up pretty quickly and you can program it to do a particular flight, or you can just take some images of a particular area to help hone in on your monitoring, your response, whatever you need it for. That was very effective.
Yeah, I was going to say here in New York, we actually did use some satellite imagery a little bit, and I think we might get back to it. But regardless, there is on-demand satellite imagery that you can do. So we used a website called Skywatch. They're not the only one, but basically you can go in and you select your area of interest, and then you give them a time frame that you would like it flown. You select the type of image that you'd like. And you can select if it's like, you know, sub half foot, sub meter, or, maybe a couple meter resolution, and you can do it that way. So, I don't know exactly the areas that we covered, but I would say, maybe 20,000, 30,000 acres or so costs us about $8,000 to get sub meter imagery on. flown when we wanted it flown. So basically, they need they need at least, I think, 10 days, they said, to guarantee they could get you a cloudless image. But otherwise, if I wanted an image of Sarnoff State Forest as soon as possible, I could go on there and type in, I'd like an image between the 17th and the 30th of June. And probably if tomorrow was sunny, the satellite would capture the image and send it to me tomorrow. So it is a little there is some price stuff going on, and I will say with that, you need a good computer because you're going to get like these huge images, huge file sizes. So that was actually an issue that we ran into with it, which has kind of made us pause and try to figure out how we can take advantage of that maybe better in the future. But anyway, satellite is an option.
Put the shorter link, take 2 of the link for Skywatch.
Yeah, I like the shorter link better.
So,
yeah. I know one thing that in Massachusetts, we're starting to get questions about if there's any grants for private citizens or nonprofits to remove these trees in Massachusetts. There's none that I know of. I reached out to several folks, and there's nothing. Another thing is like residents in certain neighborhoods are seeing people move out because of the problem, and new people moving in not realizing that they're going to have a really big bill to remove these trees soon. And they were asking me if there's anything I can do. And I'm like, no, there's nothing I can do. I said, if you want to, reach out to media or whatnot, you're more than welcome, but it's very difficult for me to do that.
your question was about funding. Was there a question in there?
No?
Okay.
Yeah, I just didn't know if anybody else knew of any grants in your areas for removal of tree for homeowners.
From the Forest Service point of view or perspective, nothing jumps to mind for something like that where we would have provided funding for that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's been the standard issue.
Yeah, we've never provided funding either, really, in New York for private properties. I mean, I think the one maybe justification is, as we've heard from a lot of the talks, right, is it's more than just tree removal. We're trying to do, the whole ecological restoration to make us more resilient in the future. So we have, we commiserate with the folks, but we also say, hey, removing the 3 or 4 trees in your yard doesn't help us as the bigger picture thing. So, and sometimes people understand that, but yeah, I don't know. In most states, I think it's really hard to give money to private entities, and like I don't know, in New York, I was just told it's impossible. I don't think that's true, but it might as well be, right? So, so yeah, we give grants out like we have in the past to communities like municipalities, or if you can give out money to friends groups, and but it always has to be, no matter who we give money to, the stipulation is generally that it has to be publicly accessible property. So yeah, we're limited on the same thing.
One of the areas, as far as building on capacity and funding, is changing the focus of that cutting. So if those trees are alive, they haven't been impacted by southern pine beetle, perhaps even if they are dead and hazard trees, but we're all a fire dependent ecosystem in this area. And so by implementing proper wildfire mitigation practices and putting in your defensible space, you're inherently removing southern pine beetle. You're thinning that stand of that forest, whether it's a private property or part of a larger contiguous, removing the hazard vegetation, which could be trees that become a hazard in close proximity to homes. So that if they do become infested with southern pine beetle, you're creating that defensive space, you're thinning the stand and protecting the homes or other infrastructure. So again, that is a something that you need to make sure that you're in compliance with the local jurisdiction as far as clearing. But to me, those kind of go hand in hand, is having those proper wildfire mitigation practices in defensible space inherently protect your house and home from the impact of southern pine beetle. It won't necessarily help for dead standing trees, though.
I mean, it looks
So,
like most of the questions that were in the chat, you guys did a good job of addressing a lot of those.
yeah, James commented it would be great if we could work to keep our message on tree removal to ecological restoration rather than wasting resources and messages on removing dead structure from the forest. Completely. And that we've really been marketing wildlife habitat in that capacity for those dead standing trees, as long as they're not a hazard tree. Health and safety is another good avenue in marketing, is, the risk reward. Those dead standing trees not only are wildlife habitat, but there's no reason to cut them if they're not posing a risk, and they become structurally unsound so rapidly, within 6 weeks to 2 months, that you don't want to be cutting those trees or anywhere near any of the trees that are dead standing. So, Tawny added, thank you for the presentations. Jake mentioned needing a market for the wood waste. I've been in contact with folks on Martha's Vineyard who take stumps and dead trees from private land waste. And we're concerned about the possibility of spreading SPB to the mainland as their waste levels increase and they're selling chips elsewhere. Does anyone want to tackle the potential of moving infested, seems like, wood chips?
Yeah, I mean, I can. I've also talked to some of those folks out there, and I mean, it's a predicament. I mean, first moving chips, I think of that as very low risk of moving, beetles into a new area where you would start an infestation. A lot of those trees are chipped and then stored in place for, sometimes 6 or 8 months before they're moved. And so, I mean, it's certainly possible for bark beetles to survive the chipping process, but you're talking about mechanically shearing. Bark's going to be flying off. The more bark that's off of the chips, the less likely beetles are going to survive. So, I think of it as really low risk. And then it does seem like the folks that I talked out there on the islands, they just had what sounds like these enormous piles of chips that they want off the island, but they don't have any ports that would accept them anyways. At least this was about 2 or 3 months ago when I was speaking to them. So no real destination for them. And, piled there over time, of course, they become less of a risk because of higher southern pine beetle mortality in the near term. And then just there's no risk at all once a couple months pass after they're chipped.
I would keep your ears open for some of those economic innovation funding that does come along. I know for myself, I use pine kitty litter, and I am completely miffed that I spend $20+ to buy pressed pelleted kitty litter. It could be an endless supply, but I know that there had been discussion of whether the pine could be used in the new innovative waste treatment for home septic systems. But if the pine can't be used, there's also plenty of unmarketable hardwood that could be used for those systems as well. That takes time and consideration, but we have an overabundance of organic material that we're looking to dispose of. So, but those innovation grants, trying to connect with some folks that have that industry or knowledge, I think could be an opportunity.
Yeah, Tony Tur and I were going to try. We had a grant that Tony kind of led the way on, but we were working together to actually try to work with NRCS to start a local biochar market. But that, of course, fell apart a couple Januaries ago. So
Um,
Oh, sorry, Polly.
no, go
Tawny's
ahead.
got. I was just Tawny has a second part there about eastern white pine and spruce in Massachusetts maybe being hit a little bit more than elsewhere. And we did have pretty much what Felicia described as exactly what I think we originally saw on Long Island too, where just these random big white pine would get attacked. They would be heavily attacked, so a lot of resin and all that, but beetles wouldn't really survive. We was it 2, maybe 3 years ago now, we did some more in-depth sampling of infested white pine on Long Island, Brookhaven, and then one of the was it a county park, Polly? I always get mixed up down there.
Yeah, South
But
Haven County Park.
South Haven, yeah. And so it was kind of the same story. White pine, eastern white pine was attacked. They looked horrible. But in a way, you could look at it and think, well, they may have won the battle for, pitching out beetles, but those trees still died. So probably because of the inoculation of the fungi. And then a very few of those those that were attacked did actually produce beetles. So we do know that like they can successfully reproduce in that, but I don't think they can sustain, a population. If we had a big spot of white pines kick up in Massachusetts or outside of there as we move forward, you may get one more generation where there's enough beetles to attack trees, but probably not overwhelm them. So it's not neither one of those species is anything I'm overly concerned about.
And the white pine, it takes longer to decline and die. You're looking at 2 years. So the first year you're hopeful, and the second year you're oh. But I think the other aspect too is that it's once it gets rocking and rolling and super active, that's when you see southern pine beetle going for secondary hosts because they're hungry. So they're looking for anything that they can get. And they're also going for undersized pines. So they prefer the larger historic pines and down to 4-inch DBH. But once you get smaller than that, you don't see them actively infesting and continuing to move to create an outbreak. It's a secondary infestation, if you will, because again, they're hungry and they're just looking for any kind of food source. So Taylor mentioned opening up the canopy helps to push out ticks, and another reason to support the process. So yes, between opening the canopy and also putting fire on the ground is probably the most advantageous to controlling the ticks, especially as mice are being found to be more of the primary carrier of ticks. So Rebecca Myers from the Vineyard, she further expresses that the chips continue to be an issue, and that the place that receives the chips is now charging $300 a load. So unfortunately, that is a problem both with disposal here on the island, where the composting facilities are exceeding the limits or reaching the limits that they are certified or permitted to have. And so it's an ongoing challenge, an issue, especially at $300 load. Russell, what is the best way to handle logs removed from infested trees on private property? That's Russell's question.
I mean, I can take a stab at that. I guess I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. And are you worried about risk? Like if you drop an infested tree and then moving that out to another area?
It sounds like it.
Yeah, so I yeah, so Southern, I mean, it's kind of complicated, really, because it depends on timing during the year, the growing season. So if you cut down, several trees and they had recent attacks, and then you move them intact, or the bowl intact anyways, that would be a lot of beetles, moving to a new site. Generally, though, those beetles wouldn't attack, they'd come out and there wouldn't be a pheromone cue to direct them to other trees to attack. So, I think in most situations, if I'm answering your question correctly, it would be low risk to move that material. Um, but it's also, I think just taking a conservative approach to, if you are ever in a situation where there's cut and remove and you take that material, 50, 60, 70 trees, whatever it is, and move that to an area. If that area is adjacent to pitch pine, you probably want to process that sooner rather than later, or if it's exposed to heat, that would be great too. So hopefully that gets at what you were asking there.
I can add one anecdote that I'm seeing here on Long Island is that one of the studies that DEC identified was that for every infested tree, it produces enough beetles to spread to infest 10 additional trees. And we had worked really hard with DOT and DPW in order to try to get them to suppress SPB that was running along the highways and the roads. That was unsuccessful. But now they're faced and are actively removing the dead standing hazard trees, very, very hazardous, but they're not removing the active infested trees. So just as a reminder that if the tree is infested with southern pine beetle and it's still green, or if the tree is fading, it is a dead tree, especially along roadsides. It's going to develop into a hazard anyways. So it's advantageous and most cost effective to cut those infested trees along with the dead hazard trees, because you're going to waste your money to have to come back and cut those infested trees that are long dead and now have spread down the road because they weren't cut in the first place. So that's been my joy in analytical SPB daily as I drive down the road. It's like, why? So Ryan Clark wants to know what the purpose of scoring along the bole of the tree is.
Yeah, that was something that we started in New York, and Jess hit on some of this where, suppression generally is not about killing beetles, but we thought, because we were going into the winter, that if we drop trees, and then because of the winter temperatures and the moisture levels that we see, that we actually might be able to kill off a lot of beetles in the suppression. So we would cut the trees, score that with the hope was that that would allow more moisture to seep into the logs. Through freezing, unfreezing, it would pop the bark and make that habitat unsuitable for the brood. And it did work in terms of the mechanical side of that the bark did generally split off. It exposed the brood. But like Jess said, and some work that Jess did as a research scientist was looking at, differences in survival and things like that. And it really didn't end up giving us much benefit. And I think part of that too is we also just, the idea was to use the winter temperatures to our advantage, but at the same time, the winter temperatures weren't really coming. We weren't getting the cold that we had expected to maybe see those first couple of years. So it's not something that we really needs to be done any longer, I think, or something that we do.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think what the data suggested without, super rigorous analysis was that the felled trees, the ones that we suppressed in the wintertime, uh, probably mostly without bark scoring, ended up having higher brood survival rates than standing trees, we thought. So like the woodpeckers were nailing the standing trees. And the felled trees, like Kevin said, maybe the temps didn't get low enough, but they were almost like solarized because we created this gap where then they were just, the trunks were being like, exposed to a lot of sunlight, and perhaps that kept them warmer. I don't know, but we had really good emergence from the felled trees, and yeah, more than the standing trees, which I thought was really, really interesting. We underestimated the woodpeckers' impact for sure.
It's amazing that you did that research to follow through. Like we have this idea and assumption, but does this work out or not? Good job.
We did it on very like very small scales, sort of there's got to be a name for that. Like research, yes. Just a lot of
I
experimentation.
also I also wonder, I know some of these we didn't talk about this part, but like southern pine beetle doesn't have great eyesight, right? Like they're looking for a tall cylinder, dark cylinder, right? Like beetles will hit you if you're standing in the
Right.
forest, if you're in the attack. But I wonder if the predators and parasitoids also work that way too. Like I'm not sure if the felled trees get the same kind of community response. I've never read about that.
Yeah, I agree. And the felled trees didn't get the same response by the woodpeckers. They didn't
Yeah, yeah.
navigate to them, which was, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, woodpeckers wrecked a couple of good experiments out there because they were really underestimated. I mean, we saw them all the time, but they completely ruined one of my experiments looking at survival. So good for them, though.
Yeah, it will in my lit review paper, like there are some papers from the 70s and 80s that cited woodpeckers as the most important predator, which I wasn't thinking about it that way in the past, but I think it's a little bit harder to maybe quantify, and the entomologists I don't think are quantifying it.
I got my I got my start with pine beetles with the Rocky Mountain pine beetle when they were taking over the Southern Rockies, and I was focusing on birds, and American three-toed woodpecker and some of those others had just unprecedented population booms with the Rocky Mountain pine beetle, and I was documenting rates of three-toed woodpecker nests that nobody had seen before. But, it was good for the woodpeckers, but there was no population boom of woodpeckers that could get ahead of the pine beetle loads, and they took the entire mountain range functionally. So they can do some good work on a small scale, but they're not going to control an outbreak.
Right. And some of the I have a whole, I think Jess and I and Rob have like our endless, and Kevin, our endless list of misnomers. But it really has to be, what suppression the beetles or the woodpeckers are providing is because the beetles are in the tree. So even the birds and the bats are not going to be effective either, because southern pine beetle dispersion is so periodic. So they would have to have a significant impact on those beetles when they're flying in that short period of time. But it's really amazing to be able to stand back in the woods and see the blonding that occurs as the woodpeckers forage and pull the bark plates off the tree. And that's a really good way to start keying in, of looking at for those signs and symptoms when there's an active infestation before the canopy fades.
That's how we
Yeah.
found a lot of them this winter. So that is good to point out to people to kind of, go out in the woods with that ecological awareness. Because you can see the bark damage. When I was going out this winter and we were starting to find them, anytime I would start hearing a couple woodpeckers, I'd go check, and it was usually pine beetles. So
Right.
they can lead you to it too. That's another good benefit of them.
And I think
Right.
the other,
Oh,
go ahead.
I was just going to mention the different heights of the tree. There can be different types of activities going on. So you might not see that many pitch tubes down low, but things could be happening up higher that the woodpeckers could be cueing you into. So being aware that, you might not be able to see the whole tree at the same level, obviously.
And it's probably obvious, but it's much easier to detect southern pine beetle before the trees start turning in the fall, the deciduous trees. It gets extremely difficult thereafter, but also the infestation will be you'll start to see the entire canopy of the tree fade. So if there is its damage to a branch or a broken branch, it's likely not southern pine beetle. The whole tree would fade at the same time. So those are some little oddball trickeries there. Any other questions? I think the only thing that I would add is that on Long Island, I don't know that it was talked about, I don't know if you touched upon it, Jake. Mark, you touched about the fuel loading, but two things that we're seeing here on the island is that the public interpreting that southern pine beetle is increasing wildfire risk or causing wildfires. And so just to clarify that there's no southern pine beetles running around with fusees starting the fires. And that as it relates to your proactive forest management, and the benefit is that if fire does get into a southern pine beetle affected stand, the degree of mop up and hazard that you're exposing your firefighters to reduce that slow lingering, very noxious white smoke is the highest level of risk to the public for suppression of those wildfires. And so you want to keep, if you can be as proactive as possible, to be putting, the cut and leave, the cut and remove, and getting that, or the heavy, 10,000 hour fuels out of those stands, or keeping fire out of those affected stands, is going to be very advantageous to protecting public health, your firefighters, but also their mental health of doing way more mop up than they ever would want to be doing to protect that public health. And as far as the increase in risk of wildfire, southern pine beetle actually reduces the intensity of the wildfire because it's thinning the canopy. And once the fire blows into a southern pine beetle affected stand where you don't have the canopy touching, the intensity actually reduces because that fire drops out of the canopy and onto the ground, so that it is able to be direct attacked. But I add that little caveat, and the reason I shared of the hazard and the smoke is that you still have, once it's on the ground, you still have that challenge of managing the fire and the mop up in that impacted stand, because you don't have that clean understory and accessibility to ensure that mop up. So it's a double-edged sword, I guess, with the fire. I don't imply that southern pine beetles reducing or beneficial to wildfire, because it has the secondary effects to smoke. And it's not going to consume all of those dead, punky pitch pines that have been laying on the ground. And so I've done a lot of outreach and with the press and the public of trying to clarify the impact of southern pine beetles on the forest stand and the fuel rearrangement related to the structure, and it's not increasing the risk of wildfire. If the wildfire risk is high, it's going to be high in the southern pine beetle affected stand equally as a closed canopy stand. So the potential for ignition is equal in both of those areas. Anything else? It's 12:30 on the dot. I want to thank everyone, Kevin, for leading the charge and wrangling us all together and identifying all the speakers, and for Mark and Caroline, Jake, Jess, Rob, and Felicia for your time and sharing your expertise and knowledge. We continue to be here as a resource for you, and please utilize the NAFSE Southern Pine Beetle page that has a wealth of resources in there. Take a look at that. There's also, if you haven't seen it, a story about a beetle is on YouTube. I don't know if it's on the NAFSE page, but it gives you a really great overview of the history of Southern Pine Beetle in the South and the impacts that have been seeing in New Jersey. So it's a very well done video. So thank you all. Thank everybody who attended, and please fill out the survey afterwards. That is going to help us determine our next steps and what information and programming that would be helpful to you as we move forward with new SPB, forest health management products and education and outreach materials. So thank you all, and bid you good day.